Preface to Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Cycling in the Alps, with some notes on the chief passes, by C.L. FREESTON, with 24 full-page drawings by A.R. Quinton. London, Grant Richards, 1900. To my fellow members of the Cyclist Touring Club, this book is fraternally inscribed. Preface. An author is the worst of all persons to appraise the value of his own work. He is none the less the best able to set forth his aims and intentions, and a preface is usually regarded as the most convenient medium for the statement thereof. This little book, then, is an attempt to introduce to a wider public the delights of the Alpine passes from the cycling point of view. So much has been written about Switzerland that it savours of the impossible to add anything that is new. Yet I make bold to say that the majority of Britons are all but entirely unaware of the extent to which the higher regions of that glorious country and the adjoining Tyrol are permeated by a system of skilfully contrived carriage roads. Still less are they aware of the fact that on every one of these it is not only feasible to cycle, but to do so with a fullness of enjoyment that is unattainable in any other part of Europe, or indeed of the world. For though there are much higher ranges than the Alps, there are none on which the road-making engineer has achieved so many triumphs. Of a truth, I have heard some persons talk as though a pass were something up which a cycle must be carried, and down which the best that could be hoped for would be that the cycle might be wheeled. The realities of the case I have endeavoured to make plain in the pages which follow. The detailed descriptions of the passes with which I have to deal were originally published in the pages of the Cyclist Touring Club Gazette, and are here reprinted with revisions. I have added several chapters, however, which I hope will materially enhance the value of the articles as they originally appeared. The touring cyclist is, above all things, practical, and in the new matter I have endeavoured to assist him with information and advice, with which I myself should have been only too glad to have been forearmed, had it been available when I started on the journeys herein described. In the chapters, moreover, which deal with individual passes, I have made practicality paramount throughout, and if the oft-recurrent inclusion of figures as to mileages, gradients, and altitudes has involved a method of narration which is mosaic, and perhaps even prosaic, the traveller who does more than merely read this book, and takes his cycle over the highways it describes, will not, I trust, be inclined to quarrel with the author on the question of literary style. C.L.F. May 1900. End of Preface. Chapter 1 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introductory. Very nebulous ideas are prevalent with respect to Alpine cycling. The available literature upon the subject is extremely scanty, for which reason it is scarcely to be wondered at if the pushing of a machine up a long pass is regarded by many as a ludicrous performance, involving an enormous amount of labour, with little by way of recompense. Others there are who imagine that though there is much climbing, there is more coasting of the risky sort, and that mad downward flights for dozens of miles, with vertiginous gyrations round appalling curves, are the normal accompaniments of cycling on the passes. The possibility of there being intervening stretches of level road, or of the scenery rewarding to a manifold degree such difficulties and dangers as may be met with on the slopes, is too readily ignored by either party. It is indeed the scenery which is the leading factor in the justification of Alpine cycling which I venture to set forth. Unless the traveller is a pedestrian, or prepared to endure the stuffy discomforts of the diligence, he will never rise to the glorious heights, nor enjoy the entrancing views that are open to the cyclist who is not afraid of work. Now this is a consideration which cannot be too forcibly impressed upon the notice of those who have not yet been to Switzerland or the Austrian Tyrol. I hope I may be acquitted of speaking without my book, for I have visited Switzerland on several occasions, both a wheel and as an ordinary tourist. I have seen most of the many show places between Bâle and the frontier on the north, east and south respectively, and have made use of the highest mountain railways and all other available methods of locomotion, save always, heaven be thanked, the eternal diligence. But never has any one of these produced the sublimity of scenery or rapturous sensations that I have derived from my journeyings a wheel. The cyclist may ride or climb into an upper empyrean to which even a Swiss railway will not carry him, with the solitary exception of the Gorner Grat, and much of the finest scenery in that noble country is centred in the districts to which, by their very altitude and grandeur, the locomotive cannot penetrate. It is not cycling enthusiasm which leads me to say this, but simply a desire to state a fact. Only the mountaineer can achieve more than is open to the wheelman, and the ordinary visitor to Switzerland, sweltering in Lucerne, or maybe in some 3,000 feet valley, his view obstructed by a mass of mountain 4 times as high, is very far removed from the sights and sounds to which a cycle could convey him. The second reason I would adduce, in a fourfold defence of alpine cycling, is that of the air it enables him to breathe, for along with the sublimity of scenery to which I have referred goes the life-giving atmosphere of the heights adjacent to the snow line. Throughout the whole of northern, central and eastern Switzerland, the ultimate limit of the railway traveller is Davos Platz, 5,115 feet above the sea, and this is so far removed from the ordinary tourist resorts that few but those prepared for a course of lethargic sightseeing en diligence would be likely to visit that pine-bordered valley, and the majority of diligence users would select another route. Even Davos Platz, however, is considerably lower than the passes I propose to describe, no less than 7 of which attain a height of 7,000 feet, while one exceeds 9,000. The purity and invigorating qualities of the air at such altitudes as these may be to some degree, perhaps, imagined. It cannot be described, nor can its full measure of innovation be appreciated unless actually enjoyed. This much it is necessary to say, I think, with a view to demonstrating that the cyclist in the higher Alps has not betaken himself thither in any spirit of mistaken enthusiasm, nor through a slavish inability to dissociate himself from his machine, but with a definite anticipation that the labour he has undertaken will not go unrewarded. But the remaining factors in the argument are paramount from the cycling point of view. Granted that the man who is prepared to entail the expense and endure the monotony of diligence or even carriage travelling, or, more sensibly, embark upon a walking tour pure and simple, may reach the same heights and share the same splendours as the wheelman who pushes his machine. The man who is driven is not his own master, and is borne along at the same pace, whether the scenery is monotonous or magnificent. The pedestrian is at least free to halt by the way, and if the road were everlastingly uphill, would, of course, be more happily circumstanced than the cyclist. But when the summit of a pass is once attained, whose is then the better part? Walking down a pass is jolting and fatiguing, and the pedestrian's labour is by no means over when he has completed his ascent. But the joys of coasting await the cyclist, coasting, too, on a scale impossible and even undreamt of within the limits of the United Kingdom. It is not to be inferred that every alpine pass can be coasted down the whole way as soon as one has climbed the other side. Just what is feasible in this direction and what is not, I will endeavour to describe in each particular case when dealing with the passes by name. But looking at the matter broadly, I have no hesitation in saying that the climbs are more than justified by the available coasting alone, apart from the grandeur of the scenery, or the breathing of that ample ether and diviner air to which I have previously referred. On the fourth factor of my argument I can hardly lay too much stress. Its predecessors might fail to convince the easy-going type of wheelman, but even he, did he but know what was in store, would at least venture upon a journey to the Engadine, even if he limited his pass climbing to the single one which would have to be crossed in order to reach that glorious region. As a cycling ground, the Engadine is unique, for it affords the rider a means of cycling 60 miles on end without a yard of walking, and yet, mark this, at a mean altitude exceeding that of the topmost peak of the loftiest mountain in Great Britain. At its highest point, the Engadine road is 6,000 feet high. It is nearly 4,000 at its lowest, and this minor difference is almost evenly distributed along the entire route, which has scarcely any undulations. And though the tendency from Maloja in the upper Engadine to Martinsbruck in the lower is of course downwards, the journey may be made without difficulty in either direction. A lofty plateau like this confers riding sensations superior to those which would accrue if one could cycle along an imaginary road made by a bridging of the intervening spaces between the summits of Ben Nevis and its neighbouring mountains for the next 60 miles. But when it is added that the beauties of the upper Engadine are among the most remarkable in Europe, and that there are few, if any, more striking highways with the same limitation of gradient than the ravine-bordered road through the lower Engadine, it must be conceded that the region is a cyclist's paradise. The passes of which I propose to speak from personal experience, with their respective altitudes above sea level, are as follows: Stelvio, 9,055 feet; Bernina, 7,658 feet; Fluela, 7,835 feet; Albula, 7,595 feet; Giulia, 7,500 feet; Maloja, 5,960 feet; Schyn, blank; Oberalp, 6,710 feet; Furka, 7,990 feet; Grimsel, 7,103 feet. Of these, the first 6 enter or adjoin the Engadine, while the remaining 4 are more westerly. I must also deal with certain connecting links between the passes named, such as the Landwasser Road, the road from Martinsbruck to Prad, the Versamstrasse, the Vorder Rhine Road to Disentis, and the Engadine itself. A glance at a map of Switzerland and the Austrian Tyrol will show that all the country indicated is practically virgin ground. Save for the fact that the St. Gotthard line crosses from north to south, there is no railway in all this region in which the diligence is supreme, and to which one can get no nearer by train than Davos Platz or Thusis on the north, and Sondrio and Chiavenna, both in Italy, on the south. Hence it will be seen that, though the passes I shall describe in no sense exhaust the cycling possibilities or the beauties of Switzerland as a whole, they do include the major portion of the country which is unattainable to the traveller by train, and which remains a terra incognita because he is averse to face the tedium and expense of the diligence journeys. The latter sometimes involve a sitting of over 14 hours, save for halts for meals, and not even the wonders of the scenery can atone for the sufferings that are inevitable to so protracted and so cramped a method of progression. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stelvio. By its height, the Stelvio claims pride of place among the Alpine passes, for it is the loftiest carriage road in Europe, and one of the highest, if not the highest, in the world. Up to the present, indeed, I have been unable to glean any precise information as to any that is higher, if by carriage roads is understood such highways as a substantial vehicle like the diligence could travel over. If there be a genuine scientifically constructed road that is higher than the Stelvio, it must be in America, and probably on Pike's Peak. The Himalayas themselves can show nothing equal to the Stelvio, a statement I make on the authority of Mrs. Workman, who in addition to her wonderful climbing feats has cycled 10,000 miles in the peninsula, and who wrote in the Cyclist Touring Club Gazette for February 1900 that the Stelvio may still claim, as far as India is concerned, to be the highest carriage road in the world. Height, however, is not the only feature of the Stelvio Pass. Its beauty is overpowering. Before I decided to cross it, I had some misgivings as to whether in this particular instance the game was worth the candle, and whether the Stelvio's superior eminence was accompanied by unlovely wildness and bare monotony. But there was no doubt as to the success of the venture, and indeed I would aver that no one could cross the Stelvio and regret it, subject to the exceptions due to unfavourable weather or unsuitability of season, which would equally apply to any other pass. As an indication of the measure of satisfaction which it affords to those who essay the undertaking, I may state that I made the ascent of this and several other passes with no other companions but my wife and a lady friend, and that when our round was over, a round involving some amount of forced marching, owing to the limited time at our disposal, and we were considering the question of whether any portion of our journey would better have been omitted, my brave-hearted fellow-travellers declared in unison, we would not have missed the Stelvio. Inasmuch as it was inevitable that their courage should be severely tried at times on a tour of this description, the testimony of the two ladies to the impressiveness of the most arduous of our climbs is not without significance. For myself, I must account the Stelvio journey as the most memorable of my experiences, which extend over 10 countries, and which, without professing to be remarkable or all-embracing, should at least have served to effect that regulation of the sense of comparison which Dr. Johnson defined as the chief use of travel. The summit of the Stelvio marks the boundary between Italy and the Austrian Tyrol. More often than not, perhaps, it is approached from the south by the ordinary tourist when desirous of escaping from the heat of the Italian plains, but for the cyclist should undoubtedly be begun from the Austrian side, for more reasons than one. The ascent is shorter from the Tyrol, and at the same time, singularly enough, less steep. The coast which follows is considerably longer, being in fact some 37 miles, and there is the added consideration that on the Austrian side, for a good number of miles, cyclists are forbidden to ride at all. The virtues of the rim brake appear to be unknown to the Austrian authorities, and in any case it is peculiar that this prohibition should be directed against cycling down the side of the mountain that is least dangerous. The embargo exists, however, and it would be but poor sport for a cyclist to make the prolonged ascent on the Italian side and find himself obliged to continue his walk when over the summit. We will assume, therefore, that the rider has ridden to the foot of the Engadine at Martinsbruck, then crosses the River Inn, and finds himself at the Austrian custom house. It is little sympathy he encounters there, for unless he be provided with the special ticket of the Cyclist Touring Club, with his photograph attached, £2 10 is demanded as duty on his machine, and nothing but gold, and gold of the Latin Union, will satisfy the officials, who will not recognise the English sovereign, and even weigh the other gold when it is tendered. Duly provided, however, with the certificate of temporary importation, so temporary that it will be handed back before 50 miles are traversed, and with one's machine desecrated rather than decorated with the official plomb, one starts for Nauders and the Tyrol. The climb to Nauders is described as a steep hill. It is more like a young pass, for it winds and winds for nearly 4 miles and is distinctly trying. It is not unattractive, however, as it is well wooded all the way, and occasionally affords fine glimpses of the valley left behind, while at the summit the last view of the lower Engadine is really admirable. Then one drops gently into Nauders, 4,468 feet, which is only noteworthy as containing an ancient castle. From here there is a splendid run of 26 miles to Prad, where the Stelvio pass may be said to commence. The first 4 miles from Nauders show a rise of 430 feet to the watershed of Reschenscheidegg, which divides the Black Sea and the Adriatic. When past the lake of Reschen, one obtains a distant but striking view of the noble Ortler range of mountains, which form the chief glory of the Stelvio pass, and excellent though the road is, a pause here is imperative, as an encouragement to face what lies ahead. The magnificent view is not inopportune. From Reschen, the road falls gently for 5 miles to St. Valentin, and thence, with gradually increasing steepness, to Marls, 3,445 feet, in 7.5 miles, and one's brake power is called fully into play during the descent into the broad valley of the Malse Heide, which is dotted with several villages, while the Benedictine Abbey of Marienberg is a prominent object to the right. Mals is a quaint old place, which one enters through an ancient gateway. The hill one has been descending for several miles runs right into the town, and here, I may remark, was the only spot in the whole of my last tour among the passes where I dismounted on a down gradient from motives of caution. Other dismounts were due to the presence of patches of new metal, muddy tunnels, halts for refreshments or punctures, but so far as mere steepness was concerned, the 2 rim brakes on my tandem were equal to the worst that Switzerland or the Tyrol could offer, and at Mals the dismount at the gateway was simply due to the fact that the street was very narrow, and there was a bullock cart blocking up the thoroughfare only a few yards away. Indeed, had the road been level, a dismount would have been equally advisable. Continuing to descend, but less steeply, the road carries one through the upper Vinschgau valley, with the village of Glurns and the half-ruined castle of Lichtenberg lying to the right, and the chateau of Schurburg to the left, to Neusponding, 2,855 feet, where the downward course ends, 6½ miles from Mals. Here one turns to the right at Hotel Hirsch, and follows a straight road for a couple of miles to Prad, 2,940 feet, crossing a marsh and the river Adige by a long viaduct. At Prad one's work begins in earnest, for the road rises to Gomagoi, 4,265 feet, in 4½ miles, or an average of 294 feet per mile. The Trafoi Bach rushes strongly down the narrow valley with several waterfalls, and the road is not unpicturesque, though as yet it offers no indication of the grandeurs to come. High up on the right lies the village of Stilfs, or Stelvio, from which the pass is named, but there is little in the way of habitation on the road itself until Gomagoi is reached, just as one's patience is on the wane with the long spell of pushing. Gomagoi has a hotel, a point to be noted, as places of refreshment or halt for the night are not numerous. It has also a fortification erected by the Austrian government in 1860, and through which one is only permitted to wheel one's machine, though it constitutes the only bit of level road in the vicinity. The gradient continues for 3½ miles at an average of 233 feet per mile. For the most part, however, it is about as steep as the ascent to Gomagoi, but becomes rideable for a brief space when near to Trafoi. The scenery has gradually been growing more and more imposing, until at Trafoi itself, 5,080 feet, it presents one of the grandest spectacles in the Alps. In the mind of every traveller, there are a few spots out of the many scenes of beauty he has encountered which are impressed with special prominence on his memory as the places to which he would gladly return some day for a more lengthened sojourn. In my own experiences, Trafoi stands out boldly amid a group of 5, of which Mürren in the Bernese Oberland, Cernobbio on Lake Como, Glengarriff in Ireland, and John o' Groats in Scotland are the remaining 4. Trafoi is but a hamlet, consisting mainly of 2 or 3 hotels, but situated opposite the giant Ortler, 12,800 feet, the highest mountain in the Eastern Alps. To the right is the Madatsch Glacier, huge but beautiful to the last degree, while the neighbouring peaks combine to form a panorama of gorgeous magnificence. Even if one turned back at Trafoi, affrighted at the prospect of further climbing, the journey would hardly have been in vain, and would have left upon the mind a fadeless imprint of transcendent loveliness. To turn back, however, is folly. Excelsior is a good motto, albeit faulty as to its grammar, and on leaving Trafoi one enters upon the wonderful scenes of zigzags depicted in the panoramic illustration which forms the frontispiece to this book. It is indeed a stupendous undertaking to carry a main road up to a height of 9,055 feet above the sea, and the way in which it winds up the lofty valley is infinitely more marvellous than would appear even from the picture, for to appreciate this engineering triumph to the full, one needs to view it from all points. A bird's-eye view shows effectively enough the angles of the road from top to bottom, but appears at the same time to flatten the route, and does not give a true sense of the downward course of the curves from right to left. To illustrate the way in which the road slopes on the mountainside, as well as descends the valley, it is necessary to study closely the other views of the Stelvio which are also included in this volume. It is a modern road, by the way, having been completed so recently as 1825, and taking into account the fact that it is cut down both sides of the mountain in the same fashion for many miles, it must be regarded as one of the chief wonders of Europe. On the Austrian side there are no less than 46 zigzags, while those on the Italian side number 38. From Trafoi to Franzenhöhe there is a rise of 2,100 feet in 4.5 miles, an average of 466 feet per mile. This is at once the most trying and the most beautiful stage of the upward journey, but if one has passed the night at Trafoi and risen at 5 in the morning, one may get through to Franzenhöhe and onto the summit itself before the sun has attained its zenith. The post hotel at Trafoi is a comfortable stopping place. The landlord speaks English, and as mountaineering is extensively carried on from this hamlet as a centre, there is no difficulty about early breakfasts. A light meal to start with will suffice one until Franzenhöhe is reached, where the last hotel on the Austrian side is situated. Good food is here obtainable, on which one may subsist until the summit is passed, while at Santa Maria, 2 miles down the other side, there is another inn. The slow ascent to Franzenhöhe, as I have said, is beautiful if arduous. A long pause should be made at the Weisse Knot, a small platform halfway up, from which a splendid view of the Madach Glacier and the Ortler Range may be enjoyed. The far-reaching line of mountains, extending right away to the snow-capped peak of the Weißkugel, is one of perfect symmetry and sublime magnificence. Deep in the valley below, centred among the pines, are the Heilige Drei Brunnen, or the 3 holy springs, though in reality they are fountains. The holy water flows from the breasts of 3 rude figures of the Saviour, Mary and St. John under a roof, and hard by are a chapel and a tavern for pilgrims. It is worth the traveller's while to visit this spot, the environment of which is peculiarly impressive, but the path from the Weisse Knot is not so good as the one from Trafoi. 2 memorials in this vicinity may be noted. One is a marble obelisk at the Weisse Knot, to the memory of Josef Pichler, who was the first to ascend the Ortler nearly 100 years ago. A little higher up, a small tablet is let into the wall to the right to commemorate the scene of a tragedy of July 1876, when Madeleine de Tourville, an English lady, was murdered by her husband, who hurled her down the slope into the abyss below. Still pressing onwards, one leaves at last the zone of trees, and only occasional dwarf pines now meet the eye. Round and round the curves, cut in regular reiteration, one pushes the machine until the small hotel at Franzenhöhe comes into sight. It stands on a tiny plateau, 100 yards or so to the left of the main road, and is shown in the foreground of the accompanying picture, which also illustrates the conformations of the pass as viewed from one side and at a considerable height. Very pleasant it is to sit in front of the hotel, the cool morning air giving zest to the more substantial refreshment it is necessary to allow oneself before mounting higher. A long rest is advisable until the toil has been forgotten, and one believes that the remainder of the ascent, 5 miles to the summit, is a separate undertaking and not part and parcel of one continuous climb. The Austrian custom house, by the way, is stationed at Franzenhöhe, and from an official whose politeness is in marked contrast with the dour severity of his brethren at Martinsbruck, a handful of gold is recovered, and the seals are removed from the machines. The final stage of the upward journey, with a gradient of 374 feet per mile, brings one speedily into the region of eternal snow. Even in July the road is flanked with great walls of it, into which one is tempted to plunge outright, for the sun's rays are growing uncomfortably strong. The combination of a bicycle and great heat with omnipresent snowbanks is unique and adds to the interest of the journey. A roadmender's hut is passed on the left, and then 9 more corners are rounded, and the summit is attained. There is a small refreshment hut to the left, opposite a roadmender's house, and a column marks the boundary between Italy and the Tyrol. It has been hard work to reach this point, but regret is impossible. The scene is magnificent. Close at hand is the glistening ice of the Eben Glacier. Great fields of snow cover the mountain slopes, and one seems to stand above instead of below an endless panorama of peaks. There is many a point in Switzerland to which men climb laboriously with alpenstock and ice axe, and get no finer view than this. But here is the all-conquering cycle, brought with less difficulty than a mountaineering trip involves, and eager to embark upon a coast of 37 miles. If the ascent was steep, the descent is steeper. In 8 miles, the road falls from 9,055 to 4,370 feet, an average of no less than 585 feet per mile. The surface is strewn with stones, and the edges of the road are unprotected. There are small pillars of sugarloaf shape at regular intervals, whether placed there to prevent the wheels of a carriage from going over the precipice, or to split up the avalanche falls in winter, I know not. But they are too low to be of use to the cyclist, and of railings there are none. Despite the roughness of the roadway, however, and the acuteness of the corners, it is possible to coast with the exercise of due care, and premising that the rider has not entered upon an alpine journey without something particularly good in the way of brakes. With 2 of these on my tandem, each acting on the rim, I was able to take every corner and ride the entire length of the Stelvio on the Italian side, save for the long series of avalanche galleries, in 2 of which the floor was so extremely muddy that no machine could keep on its keel in such awful slime. But I am anticipating. In 1½ miles from the summit one reaches Santa Maria, where one may pause for refreshment at the inn, and must halt at the adjoining Dogana. The Italian officials were studying the rim brakes of the tandem and the freewheel safety of our fellow traveller as we came out of the inn, and were visibly impressed thereby. It did not take long to pass the customs. In Italy, at all events, I had never before been let through so expeditiously, while since my previous journey the special ticket had come into force, and there was nothing but the fee for the bolletta to pay. The Italian government, by the way, now provides gilt shields like a nameplate to fasten the leaden bollo by, and the decoration looks almost imposing. Down the valley one speeds, winding backwards and forwards with constant reversals of the view, and steering round the corners with a nicety and care that not even the race path exacts. There is no banking, and the road is flattened slightly at the corners, so that if one has slid a strap along the lever of the front wheel brake, it needs to be momentarily released, or the wheel will skid. This alteration of the brake tension, in fact, is more trying than the actual steering. As the gradient is so steep and the strain on the hands considerable, one is obliged, on a tandem at least, to resort to a strap, but what is right for the straight rush is too severe for the more level corners, and to maintain control of the steering and deftly slip back the strap from a tightly wedged lever require much care. The strap, moreover, has quickly to be slid back again to the right before the machine gains too much headway. But for this modification of the gradient at the bends, the curves would present no material difficulty to a careful rider on the alert, even though, in some cases, the strata of the road are all but parallel, and it more nearly resembles a colossal piece of crimped wire than anything else to which it can be compared. On a single safety, equipped with 2 brakes, there need be no strapping of the lever, and nothing like the strain I felt upon a tandem. By the time one has dropped 3,000 feet, the covered galleries appear and convey one through the diroccamento defile. Of mountain streams there are plenty hereabouts, and the sensation of riding through the dim galleries to the sound of rushing waters is singularly weird. 2 rivers, also, the Braulio and the Adda, join forces in the valley before the series of galleries is ended. The road turns southwards before the final tunnel is reached, and the Bormio Valley affords a striking view, enclosed by several lofty mountains, one of which, the Piz Tresero, is nearly 12,000 feet high. At length one emerges from the last tunnel, and crosses a bridge which affords another fine view to the baths of Bormio, a much frequented health resort. 2 miles lower is Bormio itself, an old town with colonnades, piazzas, and other characteristically Italian features. At the Hotel Torre, be it noted, there is a landlady who not only speaks English, but provides you with excellent tea, a very rare commodity in these parts, where the decoction is usually straw-coloured, and occasionally even tasteless. At Bormio the end is reached of the extraordinary convolutions of this extraordinary pass, and the road is now a good highway, with a gently falling gradient of 100 feet per mile for 25 miles. Naturally, it affords a perfect coast, free from undue risk, save for the unconscionable Schyn and the passage of the villages over the vile pavé, of which it is of course advisable to pedal. The delights of this ride may be imagined by free-wheelers and habitual coasters. To us on our steady tandem it was unalloyed delight, and the free-wheel safety had a better chance here than on the rougher, steeper surface of the higher slopes, down which our intrepid comrades' experiences were somewhat purgatorial. Sweetly one glides to St. Lucia, and then Cepina, where the broad valley of Bormio, with its fine amphitheatre of mountains, comes to an end, and onwards through St. Antonio and the long Morignoni defile of 3½ miles, until the Val Tellina is entered, and the cold region is left behind. The Adda River runs through the broad valley, past a ruined fort. The vegetation grows in richness, and at length Bolladore, 2,820 feet, is reached, 13½ miles from Bormio. Bolladore lies to the right of the road, and is a large enough place to stay the night if need be, but it is better to continue on to Tirano if not too late. There are yet a dozen miles of coasting, and through vine-clad hills one passes swiftly the villages of Tiolo, Grossio, Grossotto, with its handsome ruined castle, Mazzo, where a landslip in 1807 blocked up the Adda and turned the whole valley into one vast lake, Tovo, Lovero and Sernio, with a short final rise to the town of Tirano, and the end of one of the finest coasts in Europe is attained. From the Stelvio summit to Tirano is a fall of no less than 7,580 feet, and the gradual transition from icy summit to verdant plain, with all the intermediate characteristics of scenery, temperature and vegetation, is, from the cycling point of view, an incomparable experience. Before leaving the subject of the Stelvio, I must add that considerable discrepancy exists in the published details as to the distances. Separate editions of Baedeker and the CTC Continental Road Book give 3 different versions. I have taken the mileages from the newest edition of Baedeker's Switzerland, however. They make the journey, particularly on the Tyrolese side, somewhat shorter than the older figures. If the latter be correct, the gradients are less severe than I have given them. If the newer figures are accepted, there are fewer miles to walk, but at the expense of added steepness. The altitudes hold good in either case. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bernina. If the beautiful Bernina Pass could always be ascended from the Swiss side, it would provide a most enjoyable journey, for the summit is easily attainable from Pontresina, and the coast to follow would be a long one. One is more likely, however, to be under the necessity of crossing it the reverse way, in order to get back to the Engadine after the descent of the Stelvio. From the Engadine, the natural thing would be to go to the summit and back as an excursion, for those bound through to Italy would be more likely to descend by the Maloja rather than the Bernina. and as the Stelvio round is best done in the direction above described, there is no inducement to descend the Italian side of the Bernina at all, unless for the sake of the coast, and a roundabout journey to Lake Como by way of Sondrio. The ascent of the Bernina, therefore, from Tirano is a necessary consequence of the Stelvio journey. As there are few convenient resting places, it is not one of the easiest journeys to tackle, and it must particularly be borne in mind that from Poschiavo to the summit there is only one hotel, and the distance is 11.5 miles, mostly of stiff climbing. It is advisable to leave Tirano early in the morning, as the valley is naturally very sultry at so low an altitude as 1,475 feet. A level road leads from Tirano to Madonna di Tirano, the next village, and then comes a rise of 335 feet in 2.5 miles to Campo Cologno, where the customs have to be passed. The staff at the Italian Dogana is very large, as a great deal of smuggling takes place in the vicinity. One of the customs officers walked with my little party when I did the journey under notice from Madonna di Tirano to Campo Cologno, and told us that he had been up all night on the hills looking for smugglers. He was saturated with rain, poor fellow. We had ridden through 20 miles of it the previous evening, and were drenched with that alone, so that his lot was indeed an unhappy one. The seals having been duly removed, we moved on a little farther to the Swiss custom house, where our special tickets passed us through in double quick time without fee or fuss of any kind. The Swiss people are not invariably adorable, but I have never found any of their customs officers lacking in courtesy, even in the days when one had to pay duty, and now that the club's special ticket franks one through, the passing of the customs, in Switzerland at all events, is a pleasure rather than an ordeal. Like all the south and southeastern fringe of Switzerland, the country remains Italian in character for a very long way up the valley. Groves of walnuts on the hillsides, and women with bright-hued headgear in the villages, suggesting Lombardy rather than the land of glaciers. A stiff mile through Campascio and Brusio brings one to a rocky gorge with innumerable waterfalls, at the end of which is Meschino, at the southern extremity of the charming lake of Poschiavo, with a first glimpse of snow-clad peaks in the distance. After 2 miles of level but thoroughly bad road along the lakeside, Le Prese is reached, and a halt is desirable. Poschiavo itself is 3 miles away from the lake that bears its name, and the Villa Ladi, with a pleasant rose garden overlooking the emerald-hued water, is decidedly the best place for a rest. Le Prese is a small watering place, with an alkaline spring, and is both primitive and placid. Poschiavo is a thriving town of some 3,000 inhabitants, who speak Italian, though 8 miles removed from the frontier. It has some handsome houses, and being the last place of importance before Pontresina on the other side of the pass, it is worth a brief inspection. We are now at an altitude of 3,315 feet, and have to ascend to 7,658 feet in 11 miles. Of these, the first 3 to San Carlo, 3,590 feet, are ridable, and then comes a stiff climb through Pisciadella and Sfazzu to La Rosa, 6,162 feet, 4.5 miles farther. The road passes through shady woods with backward vistas of the long and narrow Poschiavino valley. At La Rosa, good food may be obtained in a restaurant annexed to the inn, but the latter is only mediocre, and the traveller should push on to the summit so as to reach Pontresina for the night. The scenery is now fully alpine in character, and though the gradient is over 400 feet per mile to the summit, 3.5 miles away, the climb is much more encouraging than that from San Carlo. Round and round the road winds, with glorious retrospects, until beyond La Motta, 6,510 feet, one reaches one of the most elaborate of the many winter galleries to be met with in the Pass country. It is a substantial structure into which light is admitted through a colonnade on the lower side. Another gallery is entered a little farther on, and soon we are at the top. In some respects it is the most picturesque of all the summits, and well rewards the climb. It may happen, as was our experience, that a rainstorm is creeping up the Poschiavino valley, to be met face to face with the brilliant sunshine from the other side, and the black mass of cloud is rendered luminous with a lovely rainbow that stretches right across the rolling mist. The effect is dazzling, and tempts one to gaze and linger indefinitely at a phenomenon of nature which, familiar enough in itself, in such an environment is superbly beautiful. But the fear that our downward run may be spoiled by the oncoming storm impels us to our saddles. It is a needless apprehension, however. The rain does not cross the shoulder of the mountain, and we enjoy the brightest 9.5 miles of coasting that the heart could wish. The gradient is about 200 feet per mile for half the distance, and 161 feet for the remainder. Leaving the hospice and the Cambrena glacier, one descends to the pale green Lago Bianco, and then in quick succession to two other lakes, Nero and Minore. The zone of trees is soon reached, and before long, with startling suddenness, the Morteratsch glacier, embosomed in one of the most striking settings in Switzerland, is passed at close quarters on the left. The scene here is indeed memorable, and no wonder that the stream of carriages from Pontresina is all but constant, greatly as it retards our downward progress. But with care one may continue one's way rejoicing, through shady groves and into the gay town of Pontresina, prettiest of all the Engadine resorts, and with a wealth of attractions in one form or another that has made it world famous. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fluela. Descriptions of tours are of two types, the prospective and the retrospective. In 9 cases out of 10, the retrospective treatment is adopted. The writer tells us, with more or less circumstantiality of detail, how and when he started, where he had his meals or stayed for the night, his adventures by the way, even to the minute particular puncture, the people whom he met, and the sort of weather he enjoyed. According to the charm or otherwise of his descriptive style, and according to the amount of interest or want of it that may attach to his own personality, a story of this kind may or may not prove entertaining. Its practical worth, however, is oftener than not in inverse ratio to its wealth of personal detail. The reader does not care to know everything that happened on a particular journey, but what he himself is likely to encounter when he comes to follow in the same track. It is no concern of his that this or that incident occurred at a stated period of the itinerary, unless in the nature of things something similar is of probable occurrence when he traverses the same ground. To be useful, it seems to me, the treatment of the subject should be as far as possible prospective, sinking the personal for the most part in the severely practical. It is much easier to adopt a different method, for the necessity of including figures as to gradients and altitude has a ruinous effect upon one's rhythm, and with Switzerland as the theme, the temptation to indulge in purple patches of fine writing is as constant as it is real. But I do not forget that I am addressing a great body of genuine tourists. Probably but a few of them have been over the whole ground I have to describe, and might be interested in comparing my reflections in the light of their own experiences. The vast majority of my readers are more likely to desire as much definite information as can be given within the limits of a work of this length, with as little of the personal as possible, or of the mere impressionism that scorns all reference to useful facts and figures. And yet, momentarily, I must depart from the rule of my own making. It is several years since I crossed the Fluela Pass, and my recollections are not scientifically precise. I doubt if any man could say otherwise of the first Alpine pass up which he pushed a cycle. The new-found labour, the sublimity of the scenery, the intoxicating atmosphere, and above all, the supreme difficulty of accustoming the eye to the unwonted distances, conspire to limit the capacity for detailed observation which a later acquaintanceship with other passes renders more easy, though parenthetically it may be observed that if one is to photograph on one's brain the full measure of the splendours of these journeys, each pass must be ascended not once but many times, and with even more deliberation than the gradient itself requires. The paramount impression left on my mind at the time I crossed the Fluela was that of the utter impossibility of adapting one's vision to the stupendous heights and depths there encountered. The river flowing deep below as one descended from the summit seemed so far away that the intervening space was wholly immeasurable. In no pass that I have since crossed have I experienced a like sensation, for the rivers are often comparatively close at hand, whereas in the Fluela it survives in my recollections as peculiarly distant. Nor was this by any means the mere result of being at a great height, for it was not my first visit to Switzerland, and already I had stood 6,962 feet above the sea on the summit of the Esel, one of the peaks of Mount Pilatus. But the sense of height is governed by the nearness or otherwise of surrounding objects, and to this day I am wondering to what extent the Fluela is peculiar among the passes in conferring a sense of remoteness from a river or other visible but distant object. The only other occasion I can recall on which one felt so far away from the water below was when at the Italian lakes a year later my wife and I made a pedestrian excursion up the pilgrimage path of Monte Bispino. It is only 4,385 feet high, but when descending, and the lovely lake of Como comes in sight, it seems as though one would never reach its level, and over the triangular cobbles one's progress is so arduous that distant sheet of bright blue water remains a tiny ring for an incredibly long and tantalizing period. The Fluela Pass is most worthy of the traveller's attention because it offers the easiest and shortest route to the Engadine. Both the Albula and the Julier involve a more protracted journey by road from the nearest railway terminus. One's final choice, however, depends upon a variety of considerations, the cyclist being influenced by the amount of probable climbing, the relative claims to beauty of the three routes, and his ultimate intentions after reaching the Engadine. If it be his desire to see some amount of the lower Engadine, ride through the upper, and then descend the Maloja Pass to the Italian lakes, I should decidedly recommend him to select the Fluela route. The train will carry him to Davos Platz, whence there is a mile and a half of descent to Davos Dorf, where the Fluela road begins. As Davos Dorf is already 5,160 feet above the sea, and the summit of the pass is 7,835 feet, the cyclist has only 2,675 feet to climb, or very considerably less than if he trains to the Coire or Thusis, and ascends either the Albula or the Julier. It is quite impossible to calculate the average gradients of the Fluela, the exact mileage being unascertainable. The Continental Road Book gives 13¼ kilometres for the ascent and 14¼ for the descent, and to the best of my recollection these distances were borne out by a direction post on the summit. Baedeker, however, is altogether mixed in his distances. His intermediate stages make the ascent 9½ miles and the descent 6 miles respectively, but from his totals the ascent appears as only 8 miles, while by a reckoning on another page the distance from Davosdorf to Süss, the foot of the pass, is 17 miles. Accepting the road book figures, however, at 8¼ and 8¾ miles for the ascent and descent, we get a gradient of about 330 feet for the former and about 350 feet for the latter. It will be seen, therefore, that the pass is not one of the steepest, while it is one of the shortest. I remember that the first 5 miles at least of the ascent were comparatively easy, with an accentuated gradient nearer the top. The road is well shaded for several miles by larch groves which shield one from the sun, but in the upper stages it is magnificently wild and barren. The cattle that browse on the Fluela pastures are the handsomest in Switzerland, which is high praise. The pass is also remarkable for the richness of its flora, which carpet all but the highest slopes with brilliant masses of rhododendrons, primulas, anemones, and other flowers in wonderful profusion. There are no villages by the way, but a couple of small inns, the Alpenrose, 6,005 feet, and the Schyn, 6,370 feet, while homely food is obtainable at the hospice at the summit. Two lakes adjoin the hospice, the Schottensee to the right being silver-green in hue and filled with floating ice and snow, while to the left is the Schwarzsee with clear spring water. I remember with what an out-of-the-world feeling I lay on the bank of the first-named lake, gazing into a cloudless sky and oblivious of everything civilized. The Fluela is not quite the highest of the Swiss passes, but it is much the wildest of any on my list at all events. The descent from the hospice to Süss is the part of the journey as to which my recollections are the least precise, particularly as regards its rideability. I had only a plunger brake, which I could not use because of a transverse gash on my front tyre. It was therefore necessary to walk a good deal of the way down. If the distance is 8 3/4 miles, the gradient, as I have said, must average about 350 feet per mile, but if Baedeker be correct in his figures, the descent averages 524 feet instead. I doubt the latter figures very much, however, for I rode part of the way, and the walking was only necessary, to the best of my recollection, for the reason I have given, and not because of a steepness that would have made me dismount, even with a brake available. Of course, the more modern rim brake would take one down the 520 feet gradient with perfect comfort. As regards the scenery, it maintains its wild and rugged character throughout. There is one long tunnel cut through the rock. The Fluela, indeed, has a dread repute for avalanches, and at one point there is a fine vista of a snow-capped peak. The backward view of the Schwarzhorn is also impressive. At length, the ruined castle which surmounts a hill behind the village of Süss comes into view, and the Engadine valley is attained, 35 miles from its southern limit at Maloja, and about 25 from the Austrian frontier at Martinsbruck. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Albula. For a variety of reasons, the beautiful Albula Pass is better chosen for a return rather than an outward journey. This is not because of its gradients merely, for all the three passes which enter the Engadine from the west are alike shortest on their eastern side. One cannot always be travelling, however, in the same direction, and one of the three must be ascended on its longer side if one returns from the Engadine direct, but it should not be the Albula. To enter the Engadine by this route means that one has not mapped out a comprehensive plan. One will either miss a good deal of interesting ground, or else indulge in an unnecessary amount of doubling one's tracks. I propose, therefore, to describe this pass as it presents itself to the rider who is bidding a reluctant goodbye to the Engadine plateau. The pass begins at Ponte, 5,548 feet, and there is a steep walk of 5 miles, and then a ride of about half a mile to the summit, 7,595 feet. The gradient averages about 400 feet per mile, and the road, of course, is of the usual tourniquet description. While not remarkably picturesque in itself, its windings afford recurrent views of the snow-clad peaks one is leaving behind, and which become more and more panoramic the higher one climbs. If, before quitting the valley, one has done the Stelvio and Bernina round, the walk to the Albula summit will seem relatively easy, for though 5 miles of pushing up a 400 feet gradient is as much as is feasible at a stretch without a good rest, one has the consoling thought throughout this climb that the limit of one's patience and the end of the upward journey will be reached at the same time. The surface is mostly good, and if there is much wildness and even bareness in the scenery as the top is neared, there is an abundance of the bright blue gentians and other alpine flowers which flourish at such astonishingly lofty altitudes. The mountain cattle will challenge your right of way or scamper up and down the rugged slopes, and an occasional pedestrian may be encountered, but save these, and of course the diligences, there is not much else to look for ere the summit comes in sight. The scene is impressive by reason of its very barrenness, and the bold magnificence of its surrounding peaks to the left, the pinnacled Albula horn vying with the rugged Crastamora to the right. The hospice is a very poor affair, and unlike its neighbours of the Julier or the Fluela, provides neither tea nor coffee, both of which, however, can be obtained at Weissenstein, about 3 miles below. The Albula is one of the oldest of the Swiss passes, and for this reason, perhaps, it is one that requires considerable care in the first stages of the descent. The road is narrow, the surface bad, and railings absent where most required. In fact, the rider will find that pedalling is much to be preferred to coasting. A tight hand on the brake and a keen lookout at corners are also desirable, lest an unexpected rencontre with an ascending diligence should lead to a risky dismount. The gradient averages 415 feet per mile to the Weissenstein Inn, and though the pass is not the steepest, there is none that requires greater care. Teufelstal, by the way, is the name of this savage rock-strewn hollow between the summit and the Weissenstein, and from its grim wildness it well deserves the name. At the inn, however, one may obtain creature comforts that are not only unexpected at so great a height, 6,660 feet, but are doubly welcome after the cold comfort of the hospice above. If the rider's itinerary permits a halt of moderate duration, it may well be taken at the inn of Weissenstein, where the rugged grandeur of the scenery is impressive without being as desolately oppressive as at the summit. If the day be well advanced, however, it is unwise to linger here in the belief that a rapid run-down is in store. The descent affords one of those curious contrasts which defy the calculations of the wheelman. A given number of miles of downgrade suggests easy travelling and the annihilation of distance and time alike. But if the road be so rough as to compel one absolutely to walk, the mileage becomes much more formidable. With the Albula this is what happens at certain portions of the journey, so that a margin should be allowed in case, as is probable, the surface through the woods be too rough for comfortable riding. Good coasting may be enjoyed, however, for several miles beyond Weissenstein. It is impossible for me to give the average gradient of the winding road, for whereas Baedeker gives the distance to Bergun as 6.5 miles, the Continental Road Book sets it down at 7.5 miles, while Murray makes it only 5. About halfway down, the pale green lake of Palpoigna is passed, and fine waterfalls are plentiful on the Albula river. In Switzerland, by the way, one does not pay to see a cluster of dry rocks and a thin jet of water trickling through a spout, as at the famous or infamous Falls of Lodore. The land is full of magnificent cascades, and there are thousands which would make the fortune of the British hotel keeper or territorial proprietor if he set up a wicket gate and a collector of tolls, but which one passes almost with unconcern, because the scale by which one judges these things abroad is so immeasurably in excess of one's insular standard. Downwards one flies through the characteristically alpine hamlet of Nats, 5,725 feet, having meanwhile reached the zone of trees, and 3.5 miles farther the beautiful village of Bergun, 4,475 feet, is reached. It is picturesquely situated in a broad valley of green verdure, enclosed by richly wooded hills, and marks the commencement of a glorious descent which only needs a good road surface to intensify its delights. Not in Switzerland alone, however, has one to pay for the penalty of ruts and roughness for the aesthetic privilege of arboreal wealth, and one must pick one's way in patience, and even walk at times through the ravines and gorges of this wonderful pass. The road is hewn through the solid rock along the perpendicular side of the Bergunestein at a height of more than 4,000 feet, and so narrow is the gorge that the river roars through its stony bed for the most part unseen, and at a single point only can one view its foam of silvery blue. Winding through the dense woods, one descends to the hamlet of Ballaluna, and then to the pleasant village of Filisur, 3,410 feet, with its ruined castle of Greifenstein. A mile hence the river Landwasser is crossed, and after a sharp turn to the left, Bad Alvenu, 3,115 feet, a sulphur spring resort, is reached. The valley has now opened out, the road surface is improved, and the final stages of the journey to Tiefenkasten by way of Surava are extremely pleasant. Tiefenkasten, 2,790 feet, a village that has been almost entirely rebuilt since a fire in 1890, is strikingly situated in a hollow at the entrance of the Schyn pass, and is a lively and interesting centre of diligence excursions over the Julier, Albula and Schyn passes, and the Landwasser Road to Davosplatz. As so many routes converge to this point, it is highly probable that the cyclist may pass through it more than once during his round, wherefore it forms a convenient place for the addressing of letters and the leaving of superfluous luggage. The exact distance of Tiefenkasten from Begun is not given in any guide or road book, but Begun to Bad Alvenue is 7 miles, and thence to Tiefenkasten is approximately another 5, making a total descent from the Albula hospice of about 19 miles, mostly of picturesque and romantic country, with a fall of 4,805 feet. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Julier. A famous route is that of the Julier, and much frequented by the ordinary diligence traveller. For one reason, it is the earliest of the passes in this region to be free from snow, and is much less susceptible to avalanches than either the Albula or Fluela. Another potent inducement is the fact that it enters upon the upper Engadine at one of its most picturesque points, and plunges the tourist at once into the heart of the lake region at Silvaplana. To the cyclist it appeals if he wishes to ride the entire length of the Engadine, in which case the Julier brings him out only 7 miles away from Maloja, to which he may ride, and then, turning round, enjoy an uninterrupted run of 60 miles to the Austrian frontier at Martinsbruck. Either of the other passes would involve a much greater amount of retracing one's steps if the whole of the Engadine had to be covered, as it ought to be, or else would mean that some of the beauties of the valley must remain unknown. When first I cycled in the Engadine, for example, several years ago, I rode from Süss to Maloja and thence to the Italian lakes, and as the central portion of the long plateau is less striking than the last 16 miles, it was easy to imagine that the country below Süss waxed plainer and plainer as it grew lower and lower. No greater mistake could have been made, however, and the lower Engadine, as I have since found, is a most welcome surprise to anyone who enters on its exploration with misgiving. The cyclist should by all means ride along this wonderful valley, so lofty that it is difficult to think of it as a valley at all, from end to end. And this is best accomplished by taking the Julier on the outward journey, with the Stelvio and Bernina in prospect when Martinsbruck is reached. Failing the ascent of the Stelvio, of course, the Fluela route to Süss would be the simplest way, but would involve the covering of the 25 miles of ground from there to Martinsbruck twice over. Another consideration to the cyclist, who is more liable to vicissitudes than the diligence traveller, in respect of accidents, rainstorms, or even exhaustion, is the fact that the Julier has more villages by the way which have good hotels, and this is a point to be borne in mind by the rider who tours in the Pass country for the first time. Though starting with the best intentions as to moderation and the like, the very wide discrepancy between the mileages he has been accustomed to at home and those that are feasible in the Alps will probably have upset his calculations, and he will be glad to find a bed at times when some considerable distance from his intended destination. The Julier is less picturesque, perhaps, than either the Fluela or the Albula, but the comparative of one country may be infinitely more imposing than the superlative of another. Certainly, no one who makes the Julier his first Alpine pass will fail to be impressed with his environment at any portion of the journey, up or down. From Tiefenkasten to the summit is a distance of 21 miles, much of which has to be climbed, but intermediate stages are ridable. The road starts deeply at once from Tiefenkasten and winds along the edge of the Stein precipice through a well-wooded ravine. A tunnel is passed on the way, one of the kind which is used only when the road proper is blocked with snow. After 3 miles of pushing through the woods, the road widens into the Oberalp, a broad valley of green pastures and many villages on both sides of the Julia river. One may ride for several miles through this peaceful expanse, passing the villages of Beuvain, Conté and Savognin, otherwise known as Schweiningen. The last named is a very suitable place for a halt, if occasion requires, as there are 2 or 3 hotels and the outlook is not unattractive, with several hamlets on the adjoining slopes across the river. The road continues rideable to Tinsen, 4,070 feet, at the mouth of the Val d'Aire. It then rises steeply through rocky ravines, passing a series of 5 waterfalls to Rofna, 4,760 feet, and then over rideable but undulating ground to the pleasantly situated village of Moulin or Mühlen, 4,793 feet. From this point to Stalla is the most picturesque stage of the Julier road. The river rushes swiftly through a succession of rocky landscapes, and at a projecting corner not far from Moulin is a fine downward view into the depths of a broad ravine, with the watchtower of Spludach surmounting a well-wooded knoll, while at Marmorera, a little further on, are the ruins of 2 castles. Through the little village of Stalvedro, 5,613 feet, one pushes to Stalla, otherwise Bivio, 5,827 feet, 5 miles from Moulin. Stalla is an unlovely place, shut in by high mountains and almost devoid of vegetation. There is an hotel here if the traveller is under the necessity of stopping, but the food is dear and not of the best. The gradient between Moulin and here has averaged 206 feet per mile, but for the remaining 4 miles to the Julier summit it is 418 feet, or more than double. The scenery is bleak, barren and monotonous. The road is rough and very slippery in wet weather, and if a wet mist spreads its cold mantle over the landscape, dimly seen only a few yards ahead, the prospect is weird in the extreme. A peculiarity of the road is the prevalence of purple stones. The surface generally, in fact, is tinged with that hue. Round and round the curves one winds, meeting, perhaps, a descending diligence, or an Italian shepherd in charge of sheep that have been brought all the way from Bergamo beyond Milan, but otherwise there is no sign of life on these stony wastes. The hospice, 7,360 feet, is a small structure faced by a hut, and better fare is obtainable within than would appear probable from without. At the actual summit, 7,504 feet, stand 2 pillars of bluish stone, 5 feet high, called Julius's columns, and concerning the origin of which there has been much speculation. They are certainly of ancient date, and have been variously supposed to be the remains of a Celtic temple to Jules, the sun, or milestones on the Roman military road, built by Augustus from Chiavenna over the Maloja and Julier, or traces of the passage of Julius Caesar himself. The most tenable theory, however, is that the stones are portions of a single column formerly erected as a boundary stone, and brought from the Maloja Pass, and that, though traceable as far back as 1396, there is no proof that they are of Roman origin. It is the descent of the Julier towards the Engadine that repays the upward toil. The road winds with 2 or 3 long zigzags, and an average gradient of 257 feet per mile. The surface is good, and one may coast with care until the last straight run to Silvaplana is reached, when backpedalling is better. Surfaces appear to change greatly in this region. The Continental Road Book describes the road as poor, which fortunately is no longer the case. On the other hand, there is a stage of the Engadine between Sus and Zenets, which is given as very good, that is now in a very rough state, although to my own knowledge it was perfect in 1896. But to revert to the descent of the Julier, the ride must be ever memorable to everyone who undertakes it. First, the snow-clad mountains of the lovely Bernina range come into view, and then the gorgeous foreground of the peaks immediately behind the lakes of the upper Engadine. As these burst into sight with the green lakes below, the scene is dramatically picturesque. In fact, as a surprise view it can have few rivals. There is but one Upper Engadine, and from the Julier one sees it at its best. If the man who took his bicycle abroad saw naught else but this exquisite panorama, he would have no need to regret the journey. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Maloja. Every yard of the Maloja Pass is beautiful, and to ride from the last point of the Upper Engadine to the Lecco end of the Lake of Como is one long dream of unalloyed delight. No other alpine pass is so wonderfully verdure-clad. No other presents so continuous a sequence of valley after valley, each closing in the view and seeming to be the last, but leading into another still more opulently fertile. Of the longer passes, it represents the acme of comprehensive beauty not associated with snow-capped peaks, for the summit is only 5,960 feet high and is well within the zone of trees. The pass is startlingly effective even before one begins to ride at all. From a projecting rock at the summit, one gazes down into the yawning abyss, over 800 feet in depth, along which the road is cut in 12 appalling curves. More nearly than any other, perhaps, this precipitous fall of the road resembles the Stelvio on the Italian side, but is much less steep and much less protracted, while, being 3,000 feet lower, it is verdure-clad instead of a wilderness of sheeted snow. No visitor to the Engadine should fail to descend the Maloja. It is impossible, of course, to make the acquaintance of all the passes which adjoin the Engadine on a single tour, because there are 3 separate ways of entering, and the ideal tour, which I would venture to recommend, would be to train to Thusis, ascend the Schyn and Julier passes successively, ride from Silvaplana to Martinsbruck, cross over to Naudus, and take the Stelvio and Bernina routes which I have already described, and then from Pontresina proceed to the Maloja and descend to the Italian lakes. The return journey could be made to include the Furka and the Grimsel, though it would be less easy to bring in the splendid ride along the Vorder Rhine valley and over the Oberalp to Andermatt, which I have yet to describe. Considerable scheming is required to make one's itinerary as comprehensive as possible, and not in one journey, nor even in 2, can one do everything that is desirable. When the choice has to be made, however, I think the route I have laid down will be found in many ways the most advantageous to the man who has not previously been over any portion of the ground. To the rider already familiar with the ineffable beauties of the Italian lakes, of course, a different plan would need to be devised, but I should be sorry for the cyclist whose previous knowledge of the north of Italy destroyed the inducement to journey thither by way of the Maloja. To descend those 12 zigzags through the clustering pines is itself an experience not to be forgotten. With a rim brake it is quite feasible, but I should hesitate to place myself at the mercy of an ordinary tyre brake on this or any other alpine pass. It is pitiful to watch the German or Swiss cyclist, unacquainted as yet with the power of the rim brake, descending this or that ribbon road, with plunger brake jammed hard on, and back-pedalling with the whole force of his muscular system, while the English wheelman can ride calmly down and even coast where the other is in supreme distress. Some most elaborate arguments have been raised from time to time as to the virtues of the tyre brake and the vices of the other type. It is all very pretty to read, but with the deepest respect to the non-touring manufacturer, I, for one, can only say, "My good sir, my life is insured, it is true, but my family are in no hurry to realize on my death, and so long as I tour abroad, I much prefer to use a brake that is a brake and not a toy." A dominant feature of the upper portion of the Maloja Pass is the Orlegna River, which rushes down with a torrential force, the intensity of which I have never seen equalled. At times it runs side by side with the road, and its roar is deafening, while with the environment of lofty mountains, much nearer than is usual, completing a picture of the most awe-inspiring type, one feels for the moment to have abandoned oneself to the forces of nature. A fine waterfall may be viewed if the rider has patience enough to arrest his machine when halfway down the zigzags and follow a path to the left for a couple of minutes. The zigzags are about 2 miles in length, after which the road runs straight along to Casaccia, 4,790 feet, the highest village of the Val Bregaglia, the name by which the greater part of the Maloja Pass route is known. On the right are past the ruins of a church, said to have been built as far back as the 4th century. 3/4 of a mile below the village, the road crosses a bridge over the Orlegna, which is merged immediately into the Maira river. The latter follows the road thenceforward all down the valley. Beyond the hamlet of Lobbia, half a mile lower, several waterfalls are passed to the left, including the Albina cascade, which is said to be one of the finest in the Alps. The road begins to wind again through forest scenery, past Asarina, 4,435 feet, and the mouth of the Albina valley, until Vicosoprana, 3,565 feet, the capital of the Val Bregaglia, and 7.5 miles from Maloja, is reached. From here the road passes through a waste of curious rocks, the residuum of a mighty flood in 1870, and then follow the villages of Borgo Nuovo, 3,470 feet, and Stampa, where walnut trees and chestnuts, familiar harbingers of an Italian vale, begin to displace the groves of pines. Just short of Promontoño, 2,685 feet, 11 miles from the summit, the road is tunnelled through a rocky promontory which stretches right across the valley. The scenery has now become luxuriantly Italian, with a remarkably quick transition, and the surroundings are as picturesque as they are verdant. A ruined castle and a handsome church are commanding objects above the village, while in the romantic valley of Bondasca to the left lies the large village of Bondo, which for 3 months of the year never sees the sun. The Bondasca river flows into the Maira, which now becomes a swollen torrent. The road crosses it here, and then leads in 2.5 miles to Castasegna, 2,235 feet. This is the last Swiss village, but the scenery and vegetation, of course, are fully Italian, and vines, mulberries and figs abound. 1.5 miles farther is Villa di Chiavenna, where the Italian custom house is situated. The present-day member will pass easily by the agency of his special club ticket, but I have a lively recollection of putting down 84 lire on 2 machines at this, the first Italian dogana I had ever met. What a world of trouble the present privileges would have saved, for the Italian Lake District was then the worst of all for the cyclist to find himself in where customs were concerned, owing to the curious territorial delimitations. After leaving the dogana and the picturesquely placed village, the road passes San Croce and San Abbondio, where there is a fine double waterfall descending from a mountain lake, and then through Campedello to Pioro, now a suburb of Chiavenna, but near the scene of a bygone tragedy. 60 feet deep beneath a grove of chestnuts lies a whole town, which, with nearly 3,000 inhabitants, was buried by the fall of Monte Conto in 1618. So complete was the disaster that nothing was rescued, either alive or dead, even after long continued labour. For 10 years, it is said, large crevices had existed on the mountain, and heavy rains immediately preceded the catastrophe. Not far beyond this ill-fated spot, Chiavenna, the key of Italy, a most interesting old town, about which the late John Addington Symonds had much that was appreciative to say, is entered. From the Maloja summit to this point is a descent of 4,870 feet in 19.5 miles, or an average of about 250 feet per mile. The ride from Chiavenna to Collico, and all down the east side of Lake Como, is one on which I might descant con amore, but we must hark back to higher ground. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Schyn. Whatever his destination, no tourist who finds himself at Tiefenkasten should fail to visit the Schyn Pass. If bound for Thusis, he will of course go through that extraordinary ravine, but at least he should ride as far as the Solis Bridge, even if he has to retrace his steps. The Schyn differs from anything I have yet described, in that it has no striking altitude to boast of. It rises from Tiefenkasten, 2,790 feet, to Alversheim, 1.5 miles, probably not more than 300 feet, though in no work of reference is the height of the latter village named, and then descends to Sils, 2,283 feet, in 6¾ miles, Thusis being 3/4 mile farther at the top of a hill. To Alversheim the hill is mostly ridable, and then one enters on the most romantic descent perhaps in Switzerland. Through pine woods the road winds down for a couple of miles to the Solis Bridge, which crosses a gorge of the Albula 250 feet above the stream, with a single span of 80 feet. The sides of the chasm through which the river rushes are so close as almost to touch, and to gaze down into its depths fairly makes one's head reel. A road of amazingly beautiful construction then leads one in little more than 3 miles over more than a dozen bridges, through 4 rock tunnels and several avalanche galleries of masonry. Whichever way one looks, the scenery is to the last degree impressive, and defies all possibility of adequate description. The swift and swirling river is so deep below that a stone hurled over the parapet takes many seconds to reach the surface of the water, while the grandeur of the hills above surpasses all that the imagination alone could picture. In short, this section of the pass is the super-sublimated essence of dramatic beauty, and as a piece of engineering is a modern marvel which everyone who takes a cycle to Switzerland should make a point of seeing. It is with the utmost reluctance that one leaves the wooded but precipitous defile, and emerges towards a wider portion of the pass, where the battlements of Campi, a ruined castle of the once powerful race of the Campbells, overlooks the valley. Farther on, seen through a gap of fir trees, is the chateau of Baldenstein, and then the valley widens towards the picturesque village of Sils, rebuilt since a great fire in 1887. Between here and Thusis is another ruin, that of Ehrenfels. The neighbourhood abounds in ruined castles, and one of these, that of Hohenraethen, possesses the distinction of being the oldest in Switzerland. But whether one has time to stay at Thusis or not, to explore its manifold attractions, no cyclist who has traversed the road from Tiefenkasten will fail to regard his journey as a startling and memorable experience. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Oberalp. After the climbing and coasting of the passes in the region of the Engadine, a little straightforward riding is a welcome change. The journey I have now to describe is that from Coire to Andermatt, by way of the Versamstrasse, the Vorder Rhine Valley, and the Oberalp Pass, a distance of 58 miles, of which the major portion is ridable. It is a delightful ride too, as far as Disentis, 38½ miles from Coire, and in some respects recalls the castellated picturesqueness of the best portion of the German Rhine from Bingen to Koblenz. The broad and turbid waters of the latter, however, which more nearly resemble the Thames at Lambeth than a stream of beauty, give place to a silver-blue river of measurable width, pleasing at almost every point, and passing through a valley of ceaseless attractiveness and interest. The road runs from Coire in an almost westerly direction, but veering towards the south. There is nothing of particular note as far as Reichenau, 6 miles, and unless the cyclist wishes to see Coire, he may ride from Thusis and intercept the road at Bonaduz, 9 miles. But it is worth while to run across to Coire, by train if need be, and see the largest town in the canton of the Grisons. It is the only place for 100 miles to come at which a cycle repairer may be found, or any shopping be indulged in, and the tourist may have cause to embrace the opportunity. At Reichenau, 1,935 feet, exactly the same as Coire, an interesting spectacle is that of the junction of the Hinterrhein and Vorderrhein rivers. The former descends from the Bernardino Pass, and by its impetuosity drives back the Vorderrhein, though the latter has the greater volume of water. A double choice is now open to the rider between here and Ilantz. The more commonly used road proceeds by the way of Trins and Flames, but there is another road through Bonaduz, Fesam, Falendas and Kestris, which is preferable. It is a mile shorter and much less hilly, for whereas the Taman road, 1,935 feet and 3,615 feet, the Fesam road rises no higher than 2,980 feet. At Reichenau, therefore, the cyclist should cross the bridge to the left over the Hinterrhein, instead of the one to the right over the Vorderrhein. Bonaduz is a mile away, and there, at the junction with the road from Thusis, a turn should be taken to the right. For a mile and a half the road is straight and level, though somewhat dusty. It then ascends gradually through a wood, and emerges into a rocky ravine. The Fesamtobel river flows below in almost the same manner as in the Schyn Pass, to which the scenery bears a remarkable affinity, and the fact that this distinctly picturesque route is so little known is another evidence of the amazing prodigality of nature as seen in Switzerland. How like the Schyn Pass itself is this rock-hewn road may be gauged from the fact that at one point it crosses a wooden bridge 200 feet in width and 260 feet above the stream, thus being higher even than the Solis Bridge itself. Emerging from the gorge, one ascends a winding road, too steep to ride, through pine woods to the pretty village of Fesam, 2,980 feet, from which the view is really charming. There is level riding for a mile and a half, and then a delightful coast, with striking views, through Carrera, over another ravine, and through a rock tunnel to Valendas, 2,700 feet, thence to Kestris, and finally Ilantz, 2,345 feet, 7.5 miles from Fesam. The route is captivating throughout, and something of a revelation in the way of unexpected charms. Ilantz is an ancient town, admirably situated on both sides of the Vorderrhein river, which is crossed here by an enormous wooden bridge with a lofty roof. The type is repeated more than once before the journey up the valley is ended. On the north side of the town, the houses are quaintly fashioned, and the amateur photographer would find himself in clover in this neighbourhood. The road follows the north bank of the river for 7 miles, passing the villages of Schnaus and Ruis, where the ruins of the Jürgenberg Castle, a robber's stronghold, rise on a rocky hill, and then crosses to Tavanassa, 2,620 feet. 3 miles further, the road comes back to the north bank at Rinkenberg, but a pause should be permitted on the bridge for the sake of the enchanting view. The velvety slopes of the valley are covered with numerous villages, chapels, and ruined castles, and the scene is one of the most inviting character. I feel impelled to recommend this route to Swiss tourists very strongly, for it comes as a most pleasurable interlude after the thrilling scenery one has left behind, and also emphasises anew the sterner beauties of the high latitudes, by slowly leading up to a fresh series of lofty passes. One is thus afforded the opportunity of appreciating the unrivalled charms of Swiss pastoral scenery, as a peaceful, eye-resting contrast to the magnificence of the ice-clad summits, while the glories of the heights above the snow-line are once more impressed upon one's brain as one climbs the Oberalp, the Furka, and the Grimsel. The village of Trun, 2,820 feet, a mile and a half from Rinkenberg, is memorable as the cradle of liberty among the Rhaetian Alps, for it was here that the constitution of the Grey League was established in 1424. At Rabius, 3,133 feet, 1 3/4 miles farther, the first glaciered mountain comes into sight, at the head of the wild Somvix valley, and the village of Somvix, 3,458 feet, stands prominently forth 1.5 miles beyond. The roadway is now boldly built, and crosses the river once more over a wooden bridge 160 feet above the stream and 210 feet long. Soon afterwards the village of Disentis, 3,773 feet, 38.5 miles from Coire, is reached, and as the pass of the Oberalp is now within measurable distance, it is incumbent upon the cyclist to devote his attention to practical considerations, as this is the last place before the summit at which he can obtain a decent meal. The village is pleasantly situated, with good hotels, and unless the day is yet young, a halt should be called for the night. As an example, by the way, of the explosive force of the Alpine avalanche, it may be mentioned that at Disentis, on one occasion, the east spire of the Benedictine Abbey, which overlooks the village, was thrown down by the gust of a fall of ice which took place over 1/4 mile away. Up the narrowing Val Tavech the road proceeds, and is ridable as far as Rueras, 4,597 feet, about 7 miles farther, and midway there is a striking retrospective view of the Disentis valley. The ascent now becomes trying, and the approaching snow-clad peaks remind one that another pass has to be climbed. To Charmut, 5,380 feet, 3.5 miles farther. The road is unusually toilsome, owing to its being cut on the side of a hill, most exposed to the sun, and the journey should be arranged if possible so that this stage is taken in the early morning. Charmut is believed to be the highest village in Europe where rye is grown, but it has no other claims to distinction. The whole valley, however, is almost perpetual prey to avalanches, one of which in 1808 fell on the adjoining village of Salva and killed 42 persons and 237 head of cattle. Soon the familiar tourniquet begins, this one having 10 zigzags, and the temperature falls rapidly. Only some fine waterfalls of the Vorder Rhine and a plenitude of wild flora relieve the tedium of what is the least magnificent of the 10 passes I have to describe. At length the summit, 6,710 feet, is reached, 3.5 miles from Charmut, the gradient of the last 5 miles having averaged 384 feet per mile. A sombre lake, famous withal for trout, said to be the finest in the world, is passed on the summit, which is nearly level for about a couple of miles. The descent to Andermatt, 4,738 feet, 6 miles from the lake, is effected by 9 windings. If the surface were but decent, coasting would be feasible, but stones are omnipresent, and occasionally even walking has to be endured. Andermatt is only 20 minutes' walk from the much illustrated Devil's Bridge, and it is an interesting place. One could wish, however, that the inhabitants would pay more attention to the Oberalp road. They should know how, for the adjoining road to Hospenthal has one of the finest surfaces in Switzerland. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Furka. Of Swiss diligence roads, the Furka is the highest, though it falls far short of the Stelvio, which is half in Austria and half in Italy. The former is 7,990 feet, and the latter 9,055 feet in altitude. It is important that this distinction between diligence passes and mule tracks, or climbing paths, should be borne in mind, or the frequency with which one sees the word pass conjoined with startling figures may prove somewhat baffling to the cycling tourist. There are numerous passes in the Alps which are very considerably higher than anything on my list of 10. Several even exceed 13,000 or 14,000 feet, such as the Liesjoch, the Ippolita, the Sessierjoch, the Filikjoch, and the Vera. But these are laborious routes even to the expert mountaineer, and have not the remotest connection with cycling. On a somewhat lower scale, but still higher than the diligence roads, are certain passes up which it would be possible to push or carry a machine, but on which real cycling is impracticable. For instance, an enterprising American has taken a bicycle over the Theodule Pass, which is 10,900 feet high. But the way thither is not a road at all, but only a mule path up to the 8,855 feet level, and then is nothing but rocks and debris, and without begrudging him any satisfaction he may have derived from his excursion, I am content if I can persuade the British rider that the diligence roads are worthy his serious attention. When he has tackled the Stelvio and other lofty carriage routes, he may aim at higher game, but leave his bicycle at home, for all the American gained by his exploit was a bit of riding on a glacier at the summit of the pass. The Furka may be approached, of course, from more than one point, but for the sake of convenience I will describe the ascent as a continuation of the journey over the Oberalp, which is the way by which most cyclists would elect to travel. Starting from the Andermatt, therefore, the rider may skim along an excellent piece of road to Hospenthal, 4,800 feet, a mile and a half away, passing meanwhile the lofty glacier of St. Anna on the left. The road over the famous St. Gotthard Pass leads out of Hospenthal as well as the Furka road, and for the latter a turn to the right must be made at the top of the village. Along the left bank of the river Rielperus, the road runs for 2¼ miles to the little village of Zumdorf, and then crosses successively the Reuss and the Lochbach, the latter a stream descending from the Tiefen Glacier. The Urserental, through which the road has led us, is bounded by steep grassy slopes, down which numerous brooks find their way to the river. On the north, the Spitzberger mountain commands the valley. The road continues ridable to Rielp, 5,060 feet, a somewhat forlorn-looking hamlet about 5½ miles from Andermatt. Here the ascent of the Furka begins in earnest. It is one of 2,930 feet in about 8½ miles. As one is usually most eager for the fray at the outset, it is a consolation to know that the first 3½ miles are the steepest portion of the route, the gradient averaging 438 feet to Fuchsenegg, 6,595 feet. The labour of the ascent is rewarded by the retrospective views of the broad Urseren valley, with the windings of the descent from the Oberalp summit to Andermatt outlined in the background. If nature demands some sustenance at the termination of this initial climb, there is a small hotel, the Galenstock, at the end of the last zigzag. There is a better one, however, a mile and a half farther on, at Tiefenbach, 6,790 feet, and as the road has now become temporarily ridable, it is as well perhaps to push onwards. Another 3½ mile stage of walking is now in prospect, but with the somewhat reduced gradient of 344 feet per mile, which is sufficiently toilsome, though less arduous than the preliminary grind. The scenery is not continuously impressive on this side of the summit, but there is a fine view of the Siedeln Glacier to the right, with a striking waterfall below, and the pinnacles of the Bielenstock above. At length, the highest point, 7,990 feet, of this lofty pass is attained, and a series of buildings are encountered such as one would hardly have expected to see at such an altitude. Instead of the rude and weather-beaten hospice that is a customary feature of many of the pass summits, there are two comparatively fine hotels, one of which contains a post and telegraph office, and some fortifications with their attendant barracks. It is natural to infer that the soldiers on duty must experience a singularly cold time while on service here. If familiarity does not induce the proverbial contempt, however, they are at least favoured with the enjoyment of a remarkably fine panorama of jagged peaks and rugged hillsides flecked with snow. For about a mile the road is virtually level, and then winds down to the left in long zigzags, of which there are 7 in as many miles to the foot. As the descent is begun, the full glories of the Furka burst into view, and the grandeur of the surroundings and the bold engineering of the road itself are strikingly displayed. One has barely time to admire, however, the distant peaks of the Bernese Oberland, before, with startling suddenness, The Rhone glacier is seen immediately below, while at the second turning of the road one reaches the Hotel Belvedere, which stands at the very corner of this world-famed ice-fall. It is one of the most remarkable in Switzerland, and the road passes it at such close quarters that its weird and wonderful conformations can be seen to complete advantage. Among the carriage roads of the Alps, only the Stelvio in the Tyrol and the Col du Lautaret in the Dauphiné afford the tourist so near a contemplation of a glacier. As the Furka road winds down the mountain at one side of the great mass of ice, then along another slope directly facing it, and afterwards leads up to the Grimsel pass, from which a fresh series of views directly opposite to those from the upper slopes of the Furka may be obtained, it will be realized with what amazing variety the prospect must be invested before the glacier is lost to view. But if this gigantic mass of ice excites the admiration of the traveller who beholds it for the first time, he may still keep some in reserve for the road outlines of this extraordinary valley. In the picture on the adjoining page are seen a portion of the windings of the Grimsel highway to the left, and the lower convolutions of the Furka road. But it may be explained that, after the latter has surmounted the shoulder where the white line comes to an end, it crosses what looks like a valley, though practically on the same level, and winds up the opposing slope in zigzags very similar to those of the Grimsel in the foreground, and at length works its way round to the top right-hand corner of the ice-fall. Without exaggeration, it would be impossible to indicate broadly the outline of this portion of the road, which is not as clearly visible from the Grimsel as the latter is from the Furka. But if the reader will notice the trend of the faint wavy line on the distant slope between the top of the glacier and the extreme right of the picture, he may then appreciate the way in which the Swiss engineer has set his mark upon this magnificent defile. It has been necessary for the moment to reverse the route, as it were, in order that the nature of the descent from the Belvedere Hotel may be better understood. The gradient averages 344 feet per mile, and where the road is not strewn with stones, is rideable and even coastable, if the word may legitimately be coined. Coasting here, however, as in several other places, implies merely a cessation from pedalling, and not necessarily a rapid progression. Though the feet are on the rests, the brake or brakes must be gripped, and the rider must be ready to resume pedalling and sometimes even to dismount when the patches of loose metal are encountered. It is the custom to spread these stones on most of the routes traversed by diligences, as soon as the melting of the snows has caused the sleighs to disappear in favour of the more cumbrous vehicles, and though this usually takes place in June, the inevitable absence of such emblems of civilization as steam-rollers, combined with the comparatively small amount of traffic, results in these obnoxious obstacles to the cyclist remaining in evidence all the summer through. Always provided, however, that the attendant circumstances be borne in mind, for it is hardly to be expected that gangs of road-menders should abound on altitudes such as these, there is not much to complain of on either this or any other pass, and if one's downward progress be neither wholly free from interruption nor invariably marked by a delirious rate of speed, it does at least permit one to make use of gravity as a rule instead of muscular force, and one must be thankful that the gradients are not horrific and that the corners are scientifically curved. There may perhaps be a certain amount of risk in the riding of certain passes, because of the occasional absence of railings at the edges of terrifying precipices, but there is certainly no treachery such as may be encountered on many an English highway, where gradients are haphazard, and where corners and crossroads are simply countless. As one winds down the slope which is seen to the right of the picture, there is ample opportunity of appreciating the impressiveness of the view towards the Grimsel. The zigzags up the face of the mountain are collectively more visible than is usually the case, and above the last winding there tower some of the best-known peaks of the Bernese range, including the Finsterahorn and the Schreckhorn. In fact, the former is the highest mountain in the Bernese Oberland. There is more snow in the environment than in any of the landscapes I have dealt with since leaving the Stelvio and the Bernina summits, and for rugged grandeur the panorama has few equals on the passes. The infant Rhone meanders through the valley, which also contains a large building, the Rhone Glacier Hotel, as well as its dépendance, at which the economically disposed wheelman may prefer to sleep if tarrying for the night before attacking the Grimsel Pass. In the season, the hotel is likely to be both full and fashionable. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Grimsel. The Grimsel route is one of the most interesting the cyclist could take. Though the pass was only open to carriage traffic so recently as 1895, it has nonetheless many noteworthy associations, both historical and scientific. It has also many picturesque features, and offers one of the best opportunities of coasting obtainable in the pass country, though due care must be taken to appreciate in advance the points at which a pull-up is desirable, or the rider will be rushing by certain natural features which are worth travelling many hundred miles to see. The lower stages of the route, in fact, have long been almost overrun with tourists, but there was only a bridle path across the summit until the date named. And here let me interpose a word of counsel to all who go to Switzerland. The country is developing with remarkable rapidity, and it is absolutely necessary to invest in the latest editions of Baedeker or Murray before leaving home, and even be prepared to find new features, therein unmentioned, on one's arrival. Guidebooks are comparatively expensive, and it is a temptation to make suffice the edition with which one has previously travelled, imagining that but few alterations will have meanwhile taken place, and that they may not come within one's individual route. Such an assumption, however, would be entirely at fault. New railways, particularly of the mountain type, are springing up everywhere, and even though routes are in progress or projected which at one time seemed impossible. For example, the new extension from Coire to Thusis is only the precursor of a line that will ultimately be taken right through to the Engadine. A remarkable electric line has recently been carried to the summit of the Gornergrat in the Zermatt district, an eminence no less than 10,000 feet above the sea, while the conquest of the Jungfrau is only a question of time. The cyclist especially requires to be well posted in the most recent developments, for those summit railways are merely to be regarded as side excursions of which he may or may not care to avail himself. The through routes are likely to be distinctly useful. But what is still more to the point is that bridle paths are being converted into carriage routes, which thus extend the cycling possibilities of this magnificent country. The Great St. Bernard Pass can now be crossed in light carriages, and therefore may be cycled over if a man be ambitious to do all the high passes a wheel, though I should mention that Baedeker describes it as undoubtedly the least interesting of the series. There is a good deal of the fabulous, moreover, about the famous dogs carrying food and wine to travellers lost in the snow. Another pass that has recently been opened to carriage traffic is the Clausen, and no doubt the list is even now in course of extension, for Swiss engineers are by no means asleep. Details as to hotels and distances, too, are constantly undergoing revision in Baedeker, and the last edition of the Switzerland and Eastern Alps volumes contain a feature I have long desired to see, namely a section devoted to cycling. The information, I may add, has been furnished by the CTC Touring Bureau. From the Rhone Glacier Hotel to the Grimsel summit is only a 3 miles climb, but a stiff one withal, as the rise is from 5,750 feet to 7,103 feet, or 451 feet per mile. The slope, which is richly carpeted with the alpenrose and other flowers, is known as the Mayenwand, and the grand construction of the road may be gauged by a reference to the preceding illustration. What the ascent would mean if the road were built in the delightful Devonshire fashion of the shortest cut between 2 points, may be imagined if the reader will picture himself ascending the mountainside without the aid of the zigzags. The view embodies the usual optical illusion of foreshortening the lines of road proceeding from the left towards the centre, and thus making them appear almost level. whereas in actuality the gradient is an even progression throughout, and those apparently level stretches are just as accentuated as those which are obviously steep. The particular view, being on a large scale, also affords an adequate indication of the mode in which the corners are buttressed up. From the cyclist standpoint, it would be still better if they were banked outwardly, so as to counteract the centrifugal force of his machine when descending, but to be level is better than a banking the wrong way, as would be the case if the buttresses were not there at all. When the last look has been taken at the great glacier and the resplendent peak of the Galenstock above, the cyclist may soon embark upon the remarkable journey, mostly downward, of 20 miles to Meiringen. The gradient from the summit to the hospice, about 2 1/8 miles, is 450 feet per mile, and thence forward for 8 miles to Guttenen, 3,480 feet, it averages 333 feet per mile. Beyond that it falls to Imhof, 2,054 feet, in about 5 1/4 miles, averaging 260 feet. There is then a rise to Kirchert, so that the coasting possibilities of the Grimsel end at Imhof. On the upper slopes there are a good many stones, and dismounts are occasionally required in consequence, but from the hospice to Imhof a good deal of genuine coasting is feasible. Nothing, however, that I personally have come across can for a moment be compared in this respect with the descent of the Stelvio from Bormio onwards. Before leaving the Grimsel summit, I must not omit a mention of the Totensee, or Lake of the Dead, a lonely tarn centred in surroundings of the wildest imaginable description. Its name was long regarded as having dated from a sanguinary conflict which here took place in 1799 between the French invaders and the Austrian defenders, when the corpses of the slain were thrown into the water. It has lately been discovered, however, that the lake was known by this name as far back as 1760, and its designation must therefore be attributed to the fact that even in summer its surface is frequently frozen. From here to the hospice, 950 feet below, the road is grim and bare, the adjoining rocks being mostly of granite. Of the hospice itself, it may be said that it is probably the most interesting in Switzerland, and the details connected therewith are so voluminous that for once I must quote from a guide-book. Murray's invaluable Handbook of Switzerland contains the following instructive note. The hospice of the Grimsel, 6,152 feet, has, at least from 1544, been supported by the district of Hasli, in order to shelter those who travelled from necessity or for purposes of trade. The pass was used for an invasion of the Valais as early as 1211 and again in 1419. The present hospice is modern, its predecessor having been feloniously burnt by the innkeeper in 1852. It is a grim building of rough masonry, designed to resist a weight of snow. It contains 50 beds in cells, the lower tier over a stable for goats and cows. But the kitchen affords good fare, better far than might be expected in a spot so far removed from any other human dwelling, while electric bells, a piano, and an excellent collection of wood carvings for sale recall the outer world. The establishment includes a washerwoman and a cobbler, and they have clothes to lend to drenched travellers. It is occupied by the innkeeper from March to November. 2 servants pass the winter in the house, and 2 dogs, to detect the approach of wanderers, for even in the depth of winter the hospice is resorted to by traders from the Haslital and Valais, who exchange the cheese of the one for the wine and spirits of the other. Its situation is as wild as can be conceived, in a hollow about 950 feet below the summit of the pass, surrounded by walls and slopes of granite, of which the marks of ancient glaciers are seen 2,000 feet above the present bed of the valley. The rocks are broken, scarcely varied by patches of snow, which never melt even in summer, and by strips of grass and green moss, which shoot up between the stones, and are eagerly browsed by a flock of 150 goats. A considerable supply of peat is dug from a bog within a few yards of the door. In the bottom of this naked basin, close to the house, is a black tarn or lake. Although entirely covered with snow in winter, it is rarely frozen, as it is supplied from a warm spring. Beyond it lies a small pasturage, capable of supporting for a month or two the cows belonging to the hospice, and the servants cross the lake twice a day in a boat to milk them. It is a landscape worthy of Spitzenbergen or Nova Zembla. This wilderness is the haunt of the marmot, whose shrill whistle frequently breaks the solitude, and the chamois, become rare of late, still frequents the neighbouring heights. Both animals contribute at times to replenish the larder of the hospice. On the 22nd March 1838, the hospice was overwhelmed and crushed by an avalanche which broke through the roof and floor, and filled all the rooms but that occupied by the servant, who succeeded with difficulty in working his own way through the snow along with his dog, and reached Meiringen in safety. In the winter of 1889 to 1890, the two servants left on guard were, though entirely isolated from the world, and so high up, entirely prostrated by a violent attack of the fashionable influenza. In August 1799, the Grimsel was the scene of a remarkable skirmish. The Austrians were encamped upon it with the view of preventing the French from penetrating into the valley of the Rhone. They had possession of the whole declivity from the summit of the hospice, with a force of rather less than 1,500 men. The French, under General Gudin, consisting of about 3,600 men, were posted in the neighbourhood of Guttanen. The Austrian commander, Colonel Strauch, naturally relied upon the strength of his position, and the French general also considered it impregnable to an attack in front. He was therefore placed in a situation of great anxiety by receiving positive orders from Messina to force the pass on the 14th of August. Farner, the landlord of the inn at Guttanen, then undertook to guide the French over the mountains and glaciers east of the valley, the Gelmer and Gersten and the Nagelis Gratli, to the summit of the Grimsel, in rear of the Austrian position. The next morning, early, Gudin confided about 400 men to the guidance of Farner, and himself advanced with the main body and attacked the Austrian position in front, with the characteristic impetuosity of French soldiers. The Austrian commander was convinced that the attack could not succeed in this direction, but drew down the greater part of his force to repel it, and some sharp fighting ensued. Suddenly the Austrians were alarmed by firing on the heights to their rear, and its continuance, together with the impetuous advance of Gudin, produced a panic which ended in a disorderly flight up the Grimsel and over the pass in the direction of Obergestelen. The number of the killed is supposed not to have exceeded 150, of which the French composed a fifth part. The wounded Austrians were necessarily left to their fate, the nature of the ground rendering it impossible for such of their companions as escaped to remove them, and the French troops passed directly over into the valley of the Rhone. These details may be supplemented by a statement on the authority of a pamphlet published by the Public Improvement Society of Meiringen, that the hospice, since the beginning of the present century, has played an important part in the exploration of the mountains and glaciers of the Alpine chain, forming a safe base of operations for investigators desirous of penetrating into the previously unexplored ice fields of the Aare glacier and scaling the untrodden peaks of the surrounding mountains. Naturalists and men of science such as Hugi, Meyer, Agassiz, Desor, Vogt and others took up their quarters near the point of junction of the Finsteraar and Lauteraar glaciers, under the shelter of a huge granite block jocularly known as the Hôtel des Neuchâtelois, and spent months here in pursuit of their scientific investigations, assisted to the utmost of his power by the innkeeper Leuthold. The Hôtel des Neuchâtelois has disappeared on the ice river, but among the rocks on the left side of the Unteraar glacier stands the Pavillon Dollfus, the comfortably appointed cabane of the Swiss Alpine Club, forming the starting point for a great many most interesting alpine excursions. Professor Agassiz, by the way, has left his signature chiselled on the Helle Platte rocks at a point lower down the pass. The only snow peak visible from the hospice itself has been named after him, the Agassizhorn, and is 12,980 feet in height. There is much to excite the admiration of the wayfarer in his downward progress towards Meiringen. It is in every sense a wonderful road, which cost some £64,000 to build, and passes over 5 bridges formed out of huge blocks of granite. One of these bridges has a span of 65 feet. 3 tunnels and 4 galleries are also passed, one of the latter being 590 yards, and another 520 yards in length. After the chalet of the Reterichboden, 5,599 feet, and the Gersten Glacier have been left behind, the first trees begin to appear in the shape of stunted pines and birches, and then the Erling Glacier is seen to the right. Lower still, there is a view of the Gelmerbach Fall, which descends from the Gelmer Glacier and lake through a gully 1,000 feet in height. On the opposite side are the remarkable slabs of polished rock, known as the Helleplatte, which are the relics of an ancient glacier. Soon a forest of fine firs is entered, and one reaches the Hotel Handegg, 4,570 feet, and then the famous Handegg Fall, declared to rank next to the falls of the Rhine and of the Tosa, out of the many stupendous cataracts that Switzerland can boast. The Rhine Fall suffers by its great breadth, and only when standing in the iron cage below the castle on the Laufen side can one appreciate the immensity of the mass of descending water. On the other hand, the Handegg can be seen to great advantage from the road, and is truly a magnificent sight. The abyss is 250 feet in depth, and the river Aare descends in unbroken volume for half this distance before striking any rock. Close by, the river Erlenbach enters the same gulf, and the 2 columns of water are blended midway in the descent of the higher and more powerful fall. The foam and spray are dashed to a great height, and rainbow hues are seen hovering over the chasm between 10 and 1 o'clock. Until recently, a wooden bridge spanned the gorge close above the fall, but from the roadway a little lower down an even more impressive view may be enjoyed. In the nature of things, no picture can give effect to the realities of a scene like this, of which the thunderous roar of the waters and the refulgent iridescence of the tossing spray are such essential factors, yet alike incapable of reproduction. The 5 miles of road from here to Göttingen are a fitting sequel to the fall itself, for they are wildly picturesque, and the foaming river rushes with tempestuous force along its rock-strewn bed. 2 miles from the fall, the Schwarzbrunnen bridge is crossed, after passing the Steubenden rapids, and 1½ miles farther, the Tschingel bridge brings one back to the other side, and the valley gradually opens out to the village of Göttingen, 3,477 feet. It is the loftiest hamlet on the Grimsel road to be inhabited all the year round, and the peasants have a somewhat rigorous time throughout the winter months. Potatoes are the only vegetables that will grow here in the summer, so stony are the fields, but the hardy natives augment their incomes by acting as crystal seekers, an occupation that has been carried on for nigh 2 centuries in various parts of the country, though it was not until 1868 that some inhabitants of Göttingen made the most remarkable find on record near the Tiefen Glacier, some 15 tons of beautiful stones being obtained, of which 20 weighed over 2 hundredweight each. This village, by the way, has been twice burnt and once inundated during the present century, and the number of times one chances upon similar records in other districts shows how precarious is the existence of the Alpine peasant. In many respects, the ideas one derives from one's school days concerning Switzerland are entirely apocryphal, including the dramatic story of the national but never existent hero William Tell. There is all too dread reality, however, about the Alpine avalanche and the greatly feared Föhn, or scorching wind from the south, which at times sets whole towns ablaze. As an example of what it can accomplish, I may mention that it made 3,000 people homeless in Glarus so recently as 1861, and only a day previously the local authorities had been debating as to the maintenance or otherwise of the laws which had existed for generations, by which every fire in the town, including those employed in industries, should be extinguished when the ferns set in. Though the inhabitants had almost unanimously decided not to repeal the laws, the very next morning the furnace blast arose with unexpected speed, carried a spark from one house to another, and the town was almost entirely laid in ashes. I was told at Tiefenkasten, too, that the fire which devastated the place in 1890 was due to the same cause, while those who are acquainted with the new Beer Hotel at Grindelwald may not all be aware that it has risen on the ashes of a less imposing but more picturesque building that was burned by the Föhn some 5 or 6 years ago. Gradually becoming more wooded, and with limestone rocks eventually replacing the boulders of granite, the descending road traverses alternate gorges and green valleys towards Meiringen. The swift-flowing Aare is still the dominant feature of the landscape. Passing the hamlets of Imboden, 2,933 feet, and Innere Urweit, 2,464 feet, one's descent is ended at Imhof, 2,054 feet. After a brief period of level riding across a fertile vale, the road ascends the wooded hill of Kirchet, 2,313 feet, in long windings, and over the crest the run down to Meiringen is only 1 3/4 miles farther. The tourist who hastens forward, however, will miss the leading feature of the Grimsel route, and one of the greatest natural wonders in Switzerland, much as that phrase involves. This is the Aareklam, otherwise known as the Aareschlucht, or Gorge of the Aare, a cavernous defile of the most astounding character. It is entered at the Zuurlami Inn, near the top of the Kirchet, and diligences and carriages meet their passengers at the opposite end from that at which they enter, according to whether they are ascending or descending the Grimsel Pass. Cyclists, however, are less fortunate, for they are not allowed to take their machines into the gorge, and must either walk through and return by the high road, or retrace their steps along the gorge itself. The latter is about 1,500 yards long, and the manner of its conquest for the tourist's benefit is a characteristic example of Swiss enterprise. Practically speaking, the Aare has here buried itself below ground, not by hollowing out a valley with converging sides, but through a rocky cleft of 600 feet in depth, the sides of which are perpendicular and almost in close contact throughout. What the Swiss engineer has done is to build a narrow gangway of wood and iron along one side of the rock, not many feet above the swirling water, and the sensation of walking along these bracketed planks, with the sky almost shut out above and the boiling stream immediately below, is one of the weirdest that can be experienced in Switzerland, and possibly in Europe. I could imagine people who would ride calmly near the edges of the precipices on the most dangerous of the passes giving way to nervousness here, especially if walking through alone. There are no direction boards, and as steps and a bridge are passed, it is easy to be puzzled as to one's route. The course to adopt, however, is to follow the gangway right through, until at length one emerges into the road again. The formations of the rocks are occasionally of the most fantastic kind, and the windings of the gangway singularly bold. Novelists have made various remote spots on the mountains the scene of a murder or other tragedy, and a drama has been played at Drury Lane, in which an alpine crevasse was utilised as the locale of an attempted crime, while, as I have previously stated, the Stelvio Pass has witnessed an actual murder, that of Madeleine de Tourville, in recent times. But if ever there were a place in which an enemy or inconvenient rival could be summarily disposed of, it is in this gorge of the Aare, and it affords vivid opportunities for the romancist or dramatic author, which appear as yet to have been unused. According to the exigencies of the plot, some person could be made to come round one of the jutting corners of rock, either in time to intercept a crime, or identify the criminal. If any author feels inclined to employ either alternative, he is welcome to the suggestion, which I have not yet copyrighted, and for which I make no charge. Dramatic possibilities apart, however, the gorge is really a wonderful phenomenon of nature, the physical explanation of which is, that the waters of the Aare have brought down granite sediment from the savage wastes of the Grimsel summit, and easily cut their way through the softer limestone of the Kirchet. Until the gangway was erected, only 10 years ago, the gorge could not be penetrated except by a boat or raft, and then not without danger, while in summer, while the river was in flood with the melting ice and snow, even this was impossible. About midway along the ravine, a feathery cascade, the wispy tenuity of which recalls the Staubach Fall in the Lauterbrunnen valley, descends from the opposite cliff, and at another portion of the journey the peak of the Rislihorn may be seen in the distance through the open end of the chasm. It should be mentioned that a charge of 1 franc is levied upon all who pass through the gorge, and there are turnstiles and chalets for the sale of photographs and curios at either end. Meiringen is close at hand after one emerges at the northern exit, but there is still food for exclamation on the road to the town in the shape of a striking waterfall in full view of the highway. It is that of the Reichenbach, and leaps from a hillside in a way that is effective even in a neighbourhood where such falls abound, and impresses the spectator, though he has not long since quitted the Handegg torrent. Meiringen itself is an unusually fine centre for excursions, and is worthy of as long a stoppage as one's itinerary will permit. It is chiefly known, however, as the southern terminus of the Brünig railway, perhaps the most disappointing line in Switzerland, as it passes almost entirely through woods, which block the views of otherwise attractive scenery. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Landwasser Road. And now, though I have reached the end of the tabulated list of passes which I set myself to describe, I may legitimately include some reference to a very beautiful road, the Landwasser, and also say something in detail as to the glorious Engadine, of which I have several times made passing mention, and which to my thinking should be the objective of every cyclist who takes his machine to Switzerland. The Landwasser Road is a comparatively new thoroughfare, connecting Davos Platz with Tiefenkasten, and it may happen that it suits the convenience of the tourist to travel by this route. In my own case I decided to explore it because I had already travelled by the alternative road from Davos, namely the Fluela Pass. The Landwasser Road was finished in 1873 and cost over £20,000, which is moderate by comparison with the Grimsel, the outlay upon which was thrice as great. Nothing complimentary can be said as to the surface quality of the former. It is the worst road I have seen in Switzerland, and for a considerable distance is covered with stones as well as being narrow and rutty. This is the more surprising as it connects a wealthy town like Davos Platz with several diligence routes at Tiefenkasten, and has no great altitude to boast of. I am inclined to think, therefore, that there is something lacking in the administration of Davos, for all the roads in its immediate vicinity are in a bad state of repair. For those, however, who do not mind picking their way through stones for a change, so long as they can remain in the saddle and are not compelled to walk, the Landwasser Road may safely be embarked upon, for it is rideable if not luxurious, and there is undoubtedly much to admire at various stages of the journey. In the opinion of Murray's Handbook, the road surpasses even the Schyn Pass in variety and grandeur, and though personally I should hesitate to endorse this view, the testimony is sufficient to invest with interest a route that is little known. For about 8 miles from Davos Platz, the road is a falling one with a gentle gradient of about 100 feet per mile, which would afford a pleasurable coast were the surface adequate. The river Landwasser rushes along to the left at first, and then to the right, through a valley dotted with chalets, and accompanies the road for several miles. Frauenkirch, 4,793 feet, is the first village to be reached in 2.5 miles, its old church constituting its chief claim to picturesqueness. The valley narrows gradually, and the road quickly passes the villages of Spinabad, 1½ miles, where there is a sulphur bath, and Glaris, 3/4 mile. Schmelzboden Hoffnungsau, 4,362 feet, is the next village, 2½ miles farther, and the valley, which has been increasing in beauty, now contracts to a precipitous gorge, the road through which is known as the Zügenstrasse, from the adjoining mountain of the Züger. First on the left bank of the Landwasser, and then on the right, it leads through 4 tunnels and 2 avalanche galleries in succession, the former cut through the solid rock in the manner indicated in the accompanying illustration. After the last avalanche gallery has been passed, the cyclist must be on the lookout for a small projecting platform, the Bärentritt or Känzli, from which a singularly striking view can be obtained. The river is 250 feet below, and the Segentobel Fall, 105 feet high, to the right, drops into a valley of unique grandeur, with crags and thick forests in the foreground, and mountains in the distance. The Swiss engineer must readily be accredited with an eye for artistic effect, for the jutting platform is not an accidental feature of the thoroughfare, but has been intentionally built in order to afford a picture which might otherwise have been ignored. A winding road about 2¾ miles long now leads through forests of tall larches towards Wiesen. The ascent is too steep to ride, but is not difficult, and the outlooks it affords are worthy a measured contemplation, as also is the panorama it eventually unfolds after the woods are left behind. A broad and fertile valley now succeeds the region of ravines, and at Wiesen, 4,720 feet, 11 miles from Davos, there is one of the most charming prospects to be found in eastern Switzerland. The little village stands high upon a green and sunny slope, well sheltered from the north and northeast winds, and, as a peaceful health resort, entirely unspoiled by any undesirable adjuncts of civilization. I have never seen anything in any country that could surpass it. It is a place which, to the jaded brain worker or an author in search of absolute quietude, would prove a veritable haven of rest. At present it has one little hotel only, and one may express the pious hope that centuries may pass before the place is overrun with shops and fashionable tourists. To Tiefenkasten is a pleasant journey of 10 miles. The Tiefentobel Gorge is passed a mile away, with an avalanche gallery and another tunnel, and 2 miles farther the village of Schmitten, 4,150 feet, is reached. Crossing the Schmittertobel, one comes to Alvenö, 3,887 feet, in 1½ miles, and the road winds round the long curve of the Krappeneire ravine. A finger-post indicating the by-road to Bad Alvenö must be looked for, and a sharp turn taken to the left, after which one finds oneself in the Albula valley on the main road from the Albula Pass, which I have previously described. Bad Alvenö lies to the left of the junction, but a turn to the right must be taken, and the pleasant road followed through Surava to Tiefenkasten. If the direction post to Bad Alvenö be missed, the cyclist may reach Tiefenkasten by way of Brienz, where several roads converge. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Engadine. 60 miles of cycling without a yard of walking, and in alpine country, is assuredly as tempting as it is unique a prospect. We have seen how, on one pass after another, there has been much climbing to be done between altitudes ranging from 1,400 to 9,000 feet. Below the former limit, the possibilities of continuous riding might seem feasible enough, but there is nothing in the Engadine that is lower than 3,343 feet, while it rises even as high as 6,090 feet, so that there is no lack of invigorating air. In fact, it is bracing to the last degree, and though a difference of 2,747 feet may seem formidable enough when crowded into 6 miles of road, as on more than one of the passes, It is reduced to the infinitely little when spread over 60. So far as any perceptible gradient is concerned, the Engadine is virtually level from end to end, with very few undulations indeed, and nothing that is unridable if the route be taken from the Maloja end, and very little if from Martinsbruck. The exquisite beauty of the lakes is the leading charm of the Upper Engadine, but they are closely rivalled by the noble contours of the snow-capped peaks, and by the attractive series of picturesque villages following on each other in quick succession. No other lofty valley can equal the Engadine in this particular. It is further remarkable from the fact that it has no less than 20 tributary valleys of importance, and, as we have already seen, it is entered by 6 diligence passes, as well as numerous bridle roads. The lower Engadine is chiefly noteworthy for its well-wooded ravines, well-posted castles, and for its charming health resorts in the neighbourhood of Schulz. In dealing with the Fluela, Albula and Julier passes in turn, I have described the points of entry from the east, and it only now remains to give some necessary details of the straightaway journey from end to end. Maloja, a favourite resort of Londoners, has one gigantic hotel overlooking the Lake of Sils, and a more modest concern, but more suited to the roving wheelman, at the head of the pass. The Lake of Sils, which the road closely adjoins, is splendidly situated in an amphitheatre of mountains, and, like all the Engadine lakes, is of the loveliest emerald hue. It is about 4½ miles in length, and the village of Sils, from which it derives its name, is at its lower end. A promontory there divides it from the Lake of Silvaplana, which is 2 miles long and has very similar surroundings. The village of Silvaplana, 5,958 feet, is 7¼ miles from the Maloja Kulm, and this initial stage of the journey is a veritable dream of delight. Along a low-level lake, cycling is sultry, but here the atmosphere is as innervating as the prospect is entrancing. Silvaplana vies with Sils Maria, which is opposite to Sils, as a desirable place for a stay. A few yards farther, a third lake, that of Camphor, is reached, and at the village of that name, beyond the lake, the road divides, leading straight forward to St. Moritz-Dorf, 6,090 feet, the upper village, or to the right to St. Moritz-Bad, 5,805 feet, down by the lake, the fourth and last of the series in the valley below. It is needless to expatiate on the attractions of this well-known resort, which is a centre of fashionable activity in summer and winter alike. To the cycling tourist it is chiefly noteworthy as a place where he can find a cycle shop if need be, and buy English newspapers, but as a place to stay at it is less desirable than any in the vicinity. St. Moritz is essentially dressy, and the wheelman will have to blush for his clothes if he puts up at one of the huge and hideous hotels which have ruined the beauty of the place, both at the Dorf and the Bad. One does not know whether to be amused or saddened at the way in which Dame Fashion has invaded this mountain home, the social atmosphere of which is that of Paris, and wholly incongruous with that of nature herself. From St. Moritz-Bad, a road ascends alongside an electric tramway to St. Moritz-Dorf, and thence there is a comparatively steep descent through larch woods to the little village of Cresta, about 1.5 miles away. It is this winding hill which is the scene of the famous Cresta Run of the winter tobogganers, when the snow is artificially banked to enable them to take the corners in their downward flight. Close to Cresta is another village, that of Celerina, from which a road to the right branches off to the attractive town of Pontresina, which should of course be visited if the cyclist has not already taken the Bernina round. Pontresina is somewhat fashionable, but less so than St. Moritz, and has great natural beauties. Economical considerations, however, suggest Sarmaden as a stopping place, from which the attractions of either of these resorts may conveniently be explored. The last named village, the largest in the Engadine, is 2 miles beyond Celerina, and 15 miles from Maloja, including the diversion to St. Moritz-Bad. At Sarmaden, the valley is at its broadest, and the village commands a fine view of the Bernina chain of mountains, and a long vista of the Engadine highway. Straight through the valley flows the river Inn, from which the Engadine derives its name, and the road runs alongside, passing Bevers, 5,610 feet in 1.5 miles, and then Ponte, 5,548 feet, 2.5 miles farther. It is from here that the Albula route diverges to the left. Ponte is historically interesting as the scene of a desperate encounter between the Austrians and French 100 years ago, when a fight for the bridge lasted for 6 hours in snow that in some places was 5 feet deep. The village of Madeleine is reached in another 3/4 of a mile, and then follow 5 more villages in quick succession, namely Zuoz, Scampfs, Capella, Tinuchel and Brail. A bridge above the last named divides the upper from the lower Engadine, and already the region of pine woods and gorges has begun. Down the right bank of the river the road now runs through a thick wood to Zernetz, 4,910 feet, 17 miles from Sameden, and opens out into a wide basin. Zernetz was entirely destroyed by fire in 1872, so that the present buildings are modern. The inn is recrossed below the village, and another gorge is traversed until Süss, 4,689 feet, is reached 3.5 miles farther. It is here, it may be remembered, that the Fluela Pass enters the Engadine. A level run of 2 miles brings one to Lavin, 4,690 feet, another rebuilt village, and with gradually increasing beauty, the road leads through a rocky gateway to Gyarson, and thence through a larchwood and some meadows towards Ardets, 4,826 feet, 5 miles from Lavin, and commanded by the ruined castle of Steinsberg. Picturesque indeed are the next 4 miles of road, for it is often cut out of the solid rock and overlooks a magnificent gorge. Before Bad Tarasp is reached, the castle, which is illustrated on the opposite page, comes into view. Tarasp, 3,946 feet, is a health resort with mineral springs, and is very popular. Another and more strikingly situated sanatorium is that of Vulpera, half a mile up the hill to the right, and effectively seen from the road. It is Schulz, however, that is the most finely situated village of the lower Engadine, of which it is the capital. The panorama of mountains appears exceptionally grand, for though they are over 10,000 feet in height, the village itself is 6,000 less, so that the contrast is emphatic, while the slopes are not so near as to be oppressive. The neighbourhood abounds in chalybeate springs, and also in delightful walks, and the village is in every way a pleasant one to stay at, for the tourist or the valetudinarian alike. At the comfortable Hotel Post is an English-speaking landlord who is very amiably disposed towards cyclists, and in every way ready to meet their wants or assist them with information as to their route. We are now 50 miles from Maloja, and another 10 will bring us to the Austrian frontier at Martinsbruck. The scenery maintains its ravine-like character throughout, but high up on the left is seen the charming village of Sent. The road then leads through Krush, 4,075 feet, in 4.5 miles, past Remus, with its ruined castle of Chanov, to Strada in another 4.25 miles, and along the last 1.25 to Martinsbruck. It is more picturesque than ever, and fittingly concludes a 60 miles run, of the beauties of which this brief and imperfect review affords a most inadequate conception. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Other passes. The more one's touring experience extends, the more one realizes the unwisdom of being dogmatic as to the relative value, in regard to picturesqueness, of scenery that one has not seen. There are many passes in the Alps, and I should be sorry to make exclusive claims to beauty for those I have described, and sorry to lay down the law about those I have not crossed. But there are a few facts which I may mention, I think, with perfect propriety, in the light of what information I have been able to gather at second hand concerning other passes. There is no doubt whatever that the list I have given includes the 6 highest of the carriage roads, and also, in the Stelvio, the most beautiful. It is equally beyond question that anyone who has covered all the ground I have described has seen the major portion of the beauties of Switzerland that are only accessible by road. It remains to consider what else there is available in the way of mountain cycling that is either desirable by reason of the picturesqueness of the individual pass, or of the district to which it is the great highway. There is a little paragraph in the introduction to Baedeker's Switzerland, which runs as follows. Principal Alpine passes. Preeminent in point of scenery is the St. Gotthard, rendered easily accessible by the railway across it, but it need hardly be said that its attractions are not seen to advantage from the windows of a train. Next to it ranks the Splugen, particularly on the north side, where it coincides with the Bernardino route. The finest approach to the Engadine is by the Schyn road and the Albula pass, and the beautiful Maloja pass leads thence to the Lake of Como. From the Engadine, the interesting Bernina pass crosses to the somewhat monotonous Valtellina, the journey through which has, however, been much facilitated by the railway from Sondrio to Colico. In western Switzerland, the Simplon is justly a favourite pass, though inferior to several of the above, while the famous Great St. Bernard, apart from its hospice, is undoubtedly the least interesting of the series. It will thus be seen that Baedeker, no mean judge, awards to St. Gotthard the palm of merit. The Stelvio, of course, is not mentioned because it is not in Switzerland. I think, however, that the most beautiful portions of the St. Gotthard, even though not seen to the best advantage from the train, must nevertheless be within the altitude which the latter of itself reaches. They are certainly striking in the extreme, and though I have crossed the St. Gotthard several times by train, the interest in the journey never grows less. So far as cycling goes, however, it seems reasonable in the first place to visit those regions which the railway has not reached, and leave the St. Gotthard to a later date. In the second place, I may quote with advantage the experience of a tourist who has crossed the pass a wheel and disputes its claims to superlative beauty. In the Cyclist Touring Club Gazette of December 1899, Mr. W. Rees Jeffreys wrote as follows: "So far as I know them, I consider the Grimsel the most, and the St. Gotthard the least picturesque of the Swiss passes. Perhaps I may be permitted to shortly describe the ascent of the St. Gotthard from Airolo, where the real climb commences. Leaving Airolo after a good meal, a most necessary precaution, the cyclist slowly pushes his machine up the innumerable windings by which the road ascends. At each corner he pauses and looks down the valley. The objects that force themselves on his attention are the unpicturesque township of Airolo and the railway which enters the famous tunnel just outside the town. Higher and higher he ascends, but still Airolo and the railway. Past 2 small forts, but again Airolo and the railway. These commonplace objects pursue him, and he seems unable to leave them behind. How different this from the Stelvio! There the eye of the tourist seeks with untiring delight the snow-covered summits of the Ortler Mountains. Their grandeur and their beauty impress him more and more the higher he ascends. How different, too, from the Grimsel! Here again the cyclist looks back, with an interest that never tires, upon the unique magnificence of the Rhone glacier and the striking mountains that surround it. But interest in the St. Gotthard climb is soon exhausted, and it is with relief that after 2 hours' walking the windings are seen to terminate, and the road to enter a narrow gorge. Is it the top? Unfortunately no. In half a mile the gorge opens out and discloses another series of windings, one above the other, whose number the climber vainly tries to count. Closely hemmed in by the hills, there is nothing to arrest attention. However, after another full hour's work, the hotel near the top comes into view, and rest and refreshment are gladly sought. Resuming after a visit to the Lake of Lucendro, half a mile from the road, the descent commences. Compensation for the previous toil is found in a grand run down of about 8 miles, which even the roughness of the road and the occasional stray cattle cannot spoil, and the cyclist pulls up at Hospenthal. Here the Furka road joins the St. Gotthard, and combined they follow a level course to Andermatt. The railway, I may add, itself attains a height of 3,787 feet, and it would appear open to doubt as to whether the ascent of the remaining 3,148 feet to the summit will repay the toil, at any rate until less questionable journeys have all been taken. It may also be mentioned, by the way, that since the building of the famous tunnel and railway, the road has not been kept in good repair. With regard to the Splugen, I have long wished to cross it, but the difficulty is to do so without sacrificing much interesting ground. Now that I have covered all the passes directly entering or leaving the Engadine, I could well, and still hope to, take in the Splugen, either on the way to, or in returning from, Chiavenna, but I would strongly dissuade anyone who visits eastern Switzerland for the first or even second time to do the Splugen, at the expense of spoiling a comprehensive trip. A glance at the map will show the impossibility of avoiding this great sacrifice, if the Splugen route be chosen, especially if the fact be borne in mind that once at Chiavenna the entrancing Italian lakes are within easy reach. If one were to visit the lakes first, and return by way of the Splugen, the Maloja Pass, the whole of the Engadine and the Tyrol would have to be ignored. If, on the other hand, the Engadine were first traversed and the descent to the lakes made through the beautiful Maloja, it would be impossible to return by the Splugen unless Lake Maggiore were missed altogether, or much ground covered twice over. The Simplon, I believe, has one of the finest surfaces, and offers perhaps the finest coast in all Switzerland. Here, however, one is confronted with the route difficulty again. The Simplon is merely a connecting link between two railway terminals at Brieg and Domo d'Ossola respectively. I do not say that it is not worth the cyclist's while to cycle where the train is available, but I certainly think that so far as Switzerland is concerned, the virgin ground is much more interesting, and the probability of meeting with good services considerably greater. Where the rail supplants the diligence, the road suffers in consequence, and I have heard and read none too roseate accounts of the journey between Brieg and Geneva, where cycling is concerned. Personally, if I ever come to do the Simplon, I shall consider it as a means of taking a new route to the ever attractive Italian lakes, which I have hitherto approached from the Engadine by road, or over the St. Gotthard by rail. In that event, a train journey as far as Brieg and a cycle trip across the pass and down to Lake Maggiore would seem desirable. The description of the great St. Bernard given by Baedeker is scarcely conducive to a cycling journey in that direction, and unless a rider is possessed with the ambition to do this pass for the sake of saying that he has done it, I think it had better be left alone, especially as the cyclists whom I know to have made the ascent are the reverse of enthusiastic upon the subject. Indeed, one of them has stated that the walk up from Martigny occupied 10.5 hours. A pass well known to everyone who has visited Switzerland is the little Brünig, which connects Meiringen with Lucerne. I have been over it 2 or 3 times by rail, and had hoped to cross it by road on my last tour, but time prevented. It is worth cycling over, as the road affords more interesting views than the rail. In fact, they are mostly blotted out by trees on the train journey, and the surface is good. There is nothing of the stupendous, however, about the scenery, as the summit is only a little over 3,000 feet high. Another pass of medium altitude, which is well spoken of, is the Brenner in the Tyrol, but this of course is a long way east. 3 separate friends of mine, however, have made the journey, and report the experience as an enjoyable one. On the whole, however, I think that no one whose experience of Alpine passes is considerable will dispute the contention that the cyclist would do well, for many reasons, to concern himself with those routes I have described in detail before attempting others. One has not only to consider the suitability of each individual pass from the picturesque standpoint, but also the routes that lie before and after, and to my mind the Engadine should be the main objective of the cyclist on Swiss territory. When he has exhausted the possibilities of that delightful valley and its tributaries, the Furka and the Grimsel undoubtedly demand attention. After these, the tourist will have gained so much experience of mountain roads that he may safely be trusted to determine for himself whether or not it is desirable to explore fresh woods and pastures new. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What are the risks? Not a few persons with whom I have happened to converse on the subject have expressed astonishment at the possibility of cycling over the Alps at all, and appear to regard it as an eminently risky undertaking. This view has neither been confined to those wholly ignorant of Switzerland, nor even those whose knowledge of the country is limited to favourite centres like Lucerne or Interlaken, in short, those whose journeys have been made by rail, and who know nothing of the diligence routes. Some who have actually crossed one or other of the passes by road have regarded with unfeigned amazement the idea of cycling down the tourniquet, and shuddered palpably at the recollection of those awful corners. To share these trepidations I find it quite impossible, and I speak from actual experience of the highest, steepest, roughest and most tortuous specimens of Alpine roads. It is intelligible that a diligence passenger should entertain some degree of alarm when sitting in helpless consciousness of entire dependence on the driver's skill, the tractability of the horses, and the stability of the vehicle according to the breadth of its wheelbase and its relation to the centre of gravity. Parenthetically, it may be observed that even here there is no real cause for fear. The drivers know their work, which is to them a daily routine. The horses regard their task with unconcern, take things easily, and are long-lived, while as regards the possibility of overturning, the diligence is a weighty vehicle, and the animals are so familiar with the corners that they could in all probability make the entire journey without control. The driver's chief duty is simply to apply the skid. The cyclist, however, is in every way more fortunately circumstanced than the horse-drawn travellers whom he gaily passes in their usually solemn misery. His safety is entirely in his own hands, and provided only that his machine is adequately equipped with brake power, he is master of the situation. Let us consider in detail the main factors of presumptive risk in the negotiation, for lack of a better word, of any of the passes on the descending side. There is, firstly, the gradient itself. The corners come next in importance. After this, the degree of roughness of the surface, as affecting the steadiness of the steering, has to be considered, and the remaining items are the meeting of other vehicles, and the degree to which the roads are bordered with precipices that are unfenced. Under the first head, it is merely necessary to discover whether the inclination of the road is at any period so steep as to preclude the possibility of bringing the machine to a standstill whenever and wherever desired. Let me say at once that there is not a single spot on all the passes I have described where it is not perfectly feasible to pull the machine up at will, provided only that a good rim brake has been fitted, while the rider who has 2 brakes instead of 1 may feel the most absolute indifference on the subject of the cycle ever running away with him. The reasons why 2 brakes are better than 1 are set forth in another chapter under the heading of purely mechanical. For the present it is only necessary to emphasize the fact that the question of gradient in its downward aspects need offer no obstacle whatever to an Alpine tour. In the preceding descriptions of the various passes I have given the altitudes at intervening stages of each journey, and anyone who cares to make comparisons will find that in no case, not even on the Italian side of the Stelvio itself, will the gradient prove to be as steep as certain well-known English hills, such as Westerham in Kent, for example. There is a welcome absence, moreover, of the element of treachery in these long-drawn Alpine descents. If the figures show a fall between 2 points of so many feet in so many miles, say 1,400 feet in 4 miles, it may generally be taken for granted that it is one of 450 feet throughout. There are slight variations, of course, in places, but they are surprisingly rare, and the tourist may feel assured that at no time is there any sudden or unexpected change, or that the 1,400 feet in 4 miles may mean a series of irregular undulations presenting terrifying gradients at one stage and something inconsiderable at the next. Indeed, in one sense, it may be said that touring among the passes is infinitely safer than ordinary riding in any part of England, because the element of uncertainty is almost entirely eliminated. You may have to drop 6,000 feet in the course of your downward journey. You may have to hold the brake on for the major portion of the time, and you may have a regular succession of corners which each require some care in the getting round, but you almost invariably know the worst of what lies before you, and have not to fear the innumerable tributary roads that feed an English highway with the possibility of a collision at each, the abrupt variations of gradient which characterize our haphazard and unscientifically built roads in every county, the awkward bends, the water splashes with unridable footbridges at the side, the hills that terminate in a double right-angled turn with a blank wall opposite. I could name a dozen right off the reel. In short, the oft-recurrent irregularities of feature which have led to the erection of danger boards in thousands all over the island. I have known a man say after returning from a Swiss cycling trip, there are no dangerous hills in Switzerland, and in respect of this matter of abruptness of variation, the statement is perfectly true. The corners, it is needless to deny, do look somewhat terrifying at first sight. To take the worst examples, those on the Stelvio, it will be seen that the road practically doubles back upon itself several times over, and on the Italian side there are more of the parallel strata similar to the quartet depicted in the accompanying illustration, and even steeper in their fall. I was warned by an experienced tourist that though such corners as these were safe enough on a single, it would be impossible to take a tandem round them, but with the aid of rim brakes I was never under the necessity of dismounting. All that is necessary is to slow down sufficiently ere the bend is reached, in order to avoid overshooting the mark, and turn the front wheel well inwards within 3/4 of the way round. With a tandem, of course, it does not do to be afraid of getting well to the outer edge before slewing the handles round, or there would be danger of the back wheel skidding. But no one accustomed to tandem steering need be afraid of taking his machine over this ground. As for single safeties, their owners surely need not be affrighted by the pictures of the zigzags when they reflect upon the fact that diligences are taken daily at a trot round these corners, and a diligence is a long-based vehicle and is often drawn by a 5-horse team. Where a carriage can go, a bicycle can follow, up or down, and when it is remembered that all the routes described in this book are carriage routes, it may be added that they are, ipso facto, cycling routes as well. Ruts, to my mind, are a greater bane to the cyclist than side-slip itself, for they are infinitely more treacherous and horribly uncomfortable as well. The extent, therefore, to which one's riding is affected by the quality of the road surface is a matter of considerable moment to the cyclist who descends one of the passes for the first time. Broadly speaking, it may be said that the mountain roads generally are in surprisingly good repair, considering their altitude, the extremes of weather to which they are exposed, and the fact that the diligences descend them at a rapid trot, with the wheels locked in many places by the skid. Where actual ruts exist, I think that their presence may be ascribed to this cause more than anything else. As a matter of fact, however, the worst stretches for cycling purposes are those which pass through dense woods, and one does not need to go abroad to know the effect of overhanging trees upon a road surface. Between the altitudes of 3,000 and 6,000 feet, the arboreal vegetation is exceedingly prolific, and if the pass is cut right through a forest of firs or pines, it is likely to lose in surface quality what it gains in beauty. But though riding may occasionally be rendered somewhat difficult from this cause, the only place where I have ever found actual walking desirable for more than a few yards on a downgrade was in the Bergunestein gorge on the Albula pass, and the fact that it was nearly pitch dark at the time had no doubt some influence on the decision to dismount. Brief dismounts are occasionally required on the higher slopes by the patches of new metal which are laid annually in June after the melting of the snows. The longest strip I remember was on the Furka, just below the Hotel Belvedere, and it would measure perhaps 200 yards. There were several shorter ones on the Oberalp, especially on the Andermatt side, and some near the top of the Grimsel. But though these patches may be expected at any time on the upper heights, it does not follow that they will all be laid across the road, or that one cannot pick one's way at times through the loose stones. The only length of road that can be described as continuously stony is the Italian side of the Stelvio between San Maria and Bormio. But in this case the stones are not of the kind we call new metal, but are a permanent covering of what might be termed rubble, and though they make one somewhat apprehensive, perhaps needlessly so, as to puncturing possibilities, they do not seriously affect the steering, nor necessitate a dismount. As regards poor surfaces on level or comparatively level roads, the only instances that are impressed upon my memory are the border of the Poschiavo lake on the Bernina pass, and the portion of the Engadine between Zenets and Sus. In the former case, however, there had been a heavy fall of rain all through the night, while in the latter it may be mentioned that the road passes through a gorge and is affected accordingly. The first time I cycled in the Engadine, however, as I have stated elsewhere, the road was in excellent condition, and may be so again before any reader of these lines may pass that way. Variable conditions are not confined to one particular country, and even as regards the stony patches above referred to, it cannot be said that they are present to a greater degree than that which may be met with in an English tour. The cyclist is always liable to find road repairing in progress at one place or another, and however inconvenient it may be for the moment, he may look forward with pleasurable anticipation to the improved condition of things when next he traverses the same ground. None of the Alpine passes are so narrow that the meeting of a diligence or carriage inevitably involves a dismount on the part of the cyclist. The Stelvio is 19 feet wide throughout. There are others that are wider, and some that measure less. The Albula, to the best of my recollection, is the narrowest of those on my list. Of course one is subject to the good or ill will, as the case may be, of the individual driver, in just the same way as though one were touring elsewhere. As a rule, one can see approaching vehicles from a long distance off, owing to the gradient, but if the road winds round a projecting rock, there is no special reason why one should fail on the Alps to exercise the caution that one would use at home when nearing a corner, even if it be only in a suburban thoroughfare. Most of the horses wear full complements of bells around their collars, and the jangling of these is generally enough to herald the approach of a diligence, even if it be hidden from view, and only a high wind or the rushing waters of some mountain torrent could prevent the signal being heard in ample time. Very often, too, a diligence is closely followed by a second with a string of extra post carriages and baggage wagons behind, and when the whole cavalcade has passed, no further vehicles may be encountered for many miles. The only places where there is anything at all resembling continuity of traffic are the upper Engadine generally, and the road between the latter and the Bernina summit. This is a most beautiful drive, and is naturally much in favour with visitors to Pontresina. One of the most awkward situations in which the cyclist on any of the passes may find himself in is fortunately of rare occurrence. He may be descending a road which is built along a shelving cliff, with the higher side to his left and the lower to his right, as is shown for example in the illustrations of the Stelvio. The rule of the road being the opposite to ours, it follows that if he meets a vehicle, he should pass on the side nearest the downward slope, which may be steep, and which may also be unfenced. Truly this is a trying ordeal, and one of which I have once or twice experienced the tremors when steering a tandem over a rutty bit of road, and at the same time holding on two brakes because of the steepness of the descent. But one can always jump off when in any real doubt as to one's ability to steer through the opening, and if in my own case I chose to take the risk, it was because it is less easy for two persons to skip off a tandem simultaneously than for a solitary rider to dismount from his safety, so that a tandem steerer always prefers to stick on as long as possible. There is another course open to the rider who is inclined to cringe at the prospect of taking the outer edge, but is equally unwilling to dismount, and that is to steer right across to the inside. But he should decide quickly on the subject, and make his move some distance away from the oncoming diligence, so as to leave the driver in no doubt as to which rein to pull. He will appreciate the fact that the crossing has been done through no careless violation of the rule of the road, but from pardonable fear of the consequences of steering between the diligence or other carriage and the off side of the road. More important than the meeting of casual vehicles is the extent to which the passes are protected or unprotected by fences throughout. Speaking generally, it may be said that they are fenced. The Stelvio, it is true, has only stone sugar loaves to mark the edge, but the road is comparatively broad. The Albula, if I recollect aright, is unfenced near the top on the western side, and the road is narrow. All things considered, I think that a short section of this pass is the least safe of any I know for descending purposes. In the lower Engadine also there is some amount of unfenced roadway, but neither here nor anywhere else is there anything to cause material apprehension to a rider of average ability with a normal amount of nerve. If these qualifications are absent, alpine country is better left alone, as a cycling ground at all events. But personally I should feel anxious as to the safety of any rider of this class, even if he were only dodging butchers' carts in the roads of his own suburb. The salient factor in the situation, which I cannot emphasize too strongly, is that there is nothing in alpine cycling which demands exceptional ability, as distinct from nerve, on the part of the rider, if only his machine is in good order and adequately equipped with brake power. This distinction between skill and nerve is a vital one. A tightrope performer exemplifies both when balancing himself 60 feet above the earth. He would display skill, however, such as the ordinary individual could not emulate, even if the rope were but 6 inches from the ground. The said ordinary individual, on the other hand, may be affected by nervousness where no skill to speak of enters into the case. He could trundle a wheelbarrow along a plank laid on the ground, but would be sure to tremble if the plank were suspended between scaffold poles. Applying these analogies to cycling in the Alps, I should say that at no time is there anything which demands a skill above the ordinary, akin to that which the equilibrist puts forth, if only 6 inches from the floor, as compared with the usual mode of walking. And there are few, if any, occasions when the doing of what is perfectly feasible in itself is likely to be left undone for lack of nerve, under the influence of attendant circumstances. For my own part, I address these assurances to the nervously disposed, with the sympathy begotten of that fellow feeling that makes one wondrous kind, for so far from being the fortunate possessor of a phlegmatic disposition, I am both medically assured, and know full well to my cost, that I own a highly strung temperament, the nerve strength of which has scarcely been improved by many years of night work on the daily press. By this personal confession I hope to be acquitted of the charge of recommending to all and sundry what is only suited to the skilled and fearless rider. The machine itself, if not conforming to the conditions hereafter laid down in Chapter 17, may at any moment be a source of accident and even disaster. But actual riding on the passes is in no wise a thing to be feared, and I would willingly go over anew every yard I have covered a wheel in alpine territory, without hesitation and without a qualm. Before leaving altogether the question of vehicles, or that of unfenced precipices, I should mention that a more troublesome thing than either meeting the former or keeping away from the edges of the latter is the passing of a diligence that is going the same way as oneself. The roadway may be narrow at the time the vehicle is overtaken, and the attempt to squeeze past may be successful so far as the wheels are concerned, but the swinging cross-poles of the horses may be quite another matter, and the imminent possibility of a nasty knock may force one into the fence. Now the diligence drivers have occasionally been charged with what a Yankee would describe as pure cussedness in this matter of letting cycles pass. No doubt there are certain instances in proof of the allegation. My own experience, however, is all to the contrary effect. It must be remembered, for one thing, that the cyclist's bell is but little known in these high latitudes, and what is still more to the point is the probability that, in 9 cases out of 10, it goes absolutely unheard, even if vigorously sounded. The diligence of itself makes a considerable noise as it rumbles down a pass with the drag in situ, but the clangour of 5 strings of bells on the necks of as many horses is enough to reduce the tintinnabulation from the cycle to sheer impotence. As evidence, however, that the diligence driver who does realise the presence of an approaching cyclist from the rear is not the unmitigated churl that he has been represented to be, I may quote an incident that happened to my little party the last time I was in the Engadine. We had overtaken a diligence in the narrowest part of the whole valley, namely the gorge between Chinoskel and Zernetz. The vehicle in front was empty, except for the mails, and was going fairly fast, and I was not proposing to attempt to pass, as I knew that the ravine would shortly open out. But the driver had seen our machines outside an inn at Chinoskel, where we had called to allay our thirst, and was on the lookout for our catching up to him again, as we had already passed him once when higher up the valley. The moment he saw that the tandem was close behind, he not only drew aside to the fullest possible degree, but actually pulled up his team to a dead stop. To add to this good-natured act, he raised resounding whistles when we had passed, to warn the driver of another diligence some 50 yards ahead. This was no ordinary consideration only, it was absolutely generous. There is one class of risk remaining to be dealt with, which it is more necessary to take into account than when touring in more commonplace regions, and that is the effect which weather variations may have upon the comfort of the traveller. It may be said at once that there is no cause for alarm under this head, providing one's daily programme be mapped out with a prudent contemplation of possible eventualities. Lofty as are these wonderful passes, they are not so remote from civilization as to afford no shelter for man and beast at reasonable distances, and if belated by stress of weather, one may dine and sleep in comfort even 7,000 feet above the sea, as for example at Frausenhöhe on the Stelvio. If rain comes on heavily and shows no prospect of abatement, there is nothing for it but to sport one's mackintoshes and trudge along bravely to the nearest inn, and one may have to go no farther, and probably even less far than if touring in Wales or Ireland, in both of which countries I, for one, have endured more hardships than in Switzerland. The genuine tourist is prepared for these contingencies, and there is nothing in the Alps, so far as summer is concerned, from which he need shrink appalled. For the encouragement of the reader who proposes to venture upon an Alpine tour awheel, I may point out that there is no need to draw the worst conclusions whenever rain begins to fall. It often happens that the shower, even if heavy, is confined to a particular stratum of the atmosphere, and you may ride through it at a 6,000 feet level, for example, and when you get farther down the pass, say to 4,000 feet, you find that not only is it there perfectly clear, but that no rain has fallen at that altitude at all. Sometimes, moreover, one walks or rides into a damp mist, which is more or less disconcerting, perhaps, at first, but it will probably not be too opaque to prevent the continuance of the journey. And here too it will be found that the condition of affairs is limited in its presentment, and that you may burst into bright sunshine after a brief interval. Unless in exceptionally bad weather, I do not think that these mists are likely to be met with to a trying degree, and so far as my own experience goes, out of all the passes I have crossed, I have only once had to walk through vapour in this way. It was while ascending the Julier from the Tiefenkasten side, and I might add that the experience was one to be coveted rather than otherwise, because of the heightened effect which the Engadine unfolded after the mist had been left behind, and the splendid panorama of that lovely valley came gloriously into view. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The labour involved. In dealing seriatim with the passes herein described, I have laid down no particular insistence upon the degree of labour involved in the occasionally long and toilsome ascents, and it may be that to the majority of cyclists the prospect of severe exertion would be more likely to prevent their undertaking an alpine tour than the possibility of accident on the downgrades. I have not the smallest wish to paint a picture that is all couleur de rose, nor conveniently to ignore the hard work which is inseparable from the ascent of this pass or that. The whole object of this book is to help the reader, so far as lies in my power, to appreciate the exact circumstances of the case. It is not difficult, however, for the reader to arrive at a tolerably accurate appraisement of the amount of work that would lie before him did he decide to ascend any of the passes I have dealt with in detail. I have been scrupulously careful to give the altitudes at every point of note, and, while seated in his study chair, the tourist may draw up a plan of campaign which will tell him exactly how many miles of walking on each pass will be required, or the arduousness or otherwise of the varying stages of each individual ascent. If he already knows anything about gradients, and no tourist should be ignorant on such a topic, he may take a rise of 1 in 8 as typifying a really steep hill, such as Westerham and other familiar examples in Kent. None of the passes he will find approach this limit of severity. They are much more likely, in fact, to rise at the rate, on the average, of 1 in 15. But against this, of course, is to be set the protracted nature of the ascents, which may be continuously unridable for a dozen or more miles. There is much, however, that may be set against this apparently appalling prospect. It is rare indeed that the road is so monotonous as to be unredeemed by picturesque surroundings, which of themselves demand a frequent halt, even if the fatigue of the moment does not require it. It is rare too that the hotels or inns are so far apart that one need be in any fear of lack of food, or even accommodation for the night, if it becomes advisable to curtail the appointed programme. The cyclist's chief aim should be to dismiss all sense of anxiety from his mind, and that eagerness to get the hard work over, which is so praiseworthy as a rule, but must here be tempered by restraint. We cyclists loathe hills because they interfere with the uniformity of our progress, but if we could but bring ourselves to analyse the matter, we should find that we often do much harder work when in the saddle than in tackling the steepest and longest hill up which we have ever had to push a machine. It is because the contrast between this pushing and easy cycling on the level is so sharp that we come to hate walking with a machine at all, but in reality the pushing itself demands less labour than many would willingly devote to the pursuit of another form of exercise. For myself, I would rather ascend an alpine pass any day than row against stream, or play forward in a football team, or field at point under a broiling sun. The thing above all others that the cyclist should essay to do before beginning to ascend a pass is to get rid of the grudging feeling of distaste for every moment that he is out of the saddle. If he can do this and resign himself to the long walking with a cheerful spirit, he will reduce the sensations of fatigue by 1/2. I do not say that he will never get tired, but I do say, and emphatically, that the fatigue of pushing a machine is mental as much as physical, and that with patience as his motto, he may pull through in a way that would surprise himself at home. He will have gained permanently too when he has got back home, for the potent recollections of the long climbs will make most English hills seem short, and though he will have to work none the less hard on those which are just rideable, he will feel vastly more comfortable than of yore on those which are beyond his powers. Like most cyclists, I used to be ashamed to dismount unless actually compelled, but after my Swiss and Tyrolese experiences I have not the smallest scruple in so doing, and even welcome the very change of action that was formerly detestable. It might not be amiss, moreover, whenever the spirit of rebellion against the long-drawn spell of walking up a pass becomes particularly rampant, if the self-pitying cyclist were to transfer his thoughts for the nonce to the real alpine climber, who has no skilfully engineered carriageway to walk along, and whose labours not infrequently demand a courage that is leonine, and the strength and agility of an acrobat. Indeed, There may be many who will be deterred from cycling in the Alps by what they infer to be the arduousness of the undertaking, but there are none who have actually been over any of the passes who would for a moment think of ranking their own achievements with those of the professed mountaineer. The contrast between the broad roadway and the jagged peaks that tower above is too immediate to permit of any boasting on the part of the wheelman, nor does it avail for anyone to retort that the latter is especially handicapped by his machine, for the climber must needs carry almost as great a weight as that which the cyclist rolls easily along. I fancy that if Sir Martin Conway, who is a cyclist as well as a world-famous climber, were sounded on the subject, he would not dissuade the ambitious wheelman from an Alpine tour on the score of excessive toil. The most striking testimony in favour of cycling in these high latitudes is the fact that all whom I have known to indulge therein have spoken in no doubtful strain, but have advised others to go and do likewise. In some correspondence, for example, that was published in the Cyclists' Touring Club Gazette of December 1899, one member confessed to having ascended 14 passes and descanted on the exhilaration and grandeur of his experiences. Another member, referring to the stiffest climb of all, the Stelvio, wrote, "The splendour of the scenery, the excellent condition of the road surface, the great height attained, all these combine to make the crossing of the Stelvio a unique experience. In the course of cycle tours extending into 10 countries, I have found no cycle ride to equal it. The run from the top of the pass to Bormio Baths, the steepest part of the descent, if taken at a high rate of speed, affords, I consider, one of those few moments of wild excitement and exhilaration which occur but rarely in a lifetime. There is no suggestion here as to the fatigue of the previous ascent on the Austrian side. All such is forgotten in the grandeur of the landscape and the thrill of the rapturous descent. The bracing properties of the Alpine air must not be forgotten when considering the question of labour on the upgrades. This stimulus is particularly noticeable in the early morning, wherefore it is always politic to rise betimes and start before the sun has attained its full power. At midday, of course, the strength of its rays is considerable, because of the rarefaction of the atmosphere when one has reached a point several thousand feet above sea level. The presence of banks of snow, however, has a tempering effect upon the heat, and at its worst this is far less enervating than that of an English summer. The passes, too, are none of them so lofty as to affect the respiration, and even on the top of the Stelvio itself there is no consciousness of the necessity for that rapid breathing which is essential in still higher latitudes. A word of warning is desirable, however, if the cyclist happens to find himself at midday at an intermediate altitude, where the zone of snow has not been entered, and the heat is really distressing, because the road happens to be cut on the side of the hill which is not in the shade. At such a time he must not be tempted to drink of the ice water which comes trickling down the slopes. He may sip it to cool his throat, but if he imbibes an appreciable quantity, it may prove too much for his vitality. In moderation I have refreshed myself with ice-cold water, as high even as Franzenhöhe, over 7,000 feet up, without any ill effects. But the result of more liberal indulgence on the Oberalp, between Disentis and Chiamut, was a temporary but inglorious collapse. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Purely mechanical. Strength with lightness is a double virtue that is always claimed, and rightly, in behalf of the modern cycle. Weight for weight, in fact, it is the most effective machine yet known to man. Nevertheless, when cycling in alpine regions, one is forced at times to yearn for the impossible, and sigh for a machine so strong as to be incapable of damage, but which should possess the magical quality of fading into airy insubstantiality as each long ascent is tackled in turn. No dread of toil, however, should be permitted to interfere with the prudent equipment of the cycle. A man may have toured in many countries and learned the value of a trustworthy machine, but he will never fully realize the degree to which his life depends upon his mount until he has taken it up and down a typical Swiss pass. There must be no possibility of loss of control here, no nerve-destroying fear of something giving way at a crucial moment, when all one's energies are needed for the safe steering of the cycle over a stony patch, perhaps at the very edge of a steep precipice. Confidence in one's machine can only be engendered by the knowledge that in the first instance it has been judiciously selected, and that it has been effectively overhauled before the journey has begun. And with respect to that initial requisite, it is not enough to quote merely the trite advice as to going to a maker of repute. There are makers of repute whose machines won't bear the test of alpine work, but whose reputation none the less survives, because the hard-riding cyclist is in the minority, and because, when a breakdown does occur, the fact is often known only to the victim's immediate circle of acquaintances. I shudder to think of the fate that might have befallen a pair of riders who toured in Switzerland on a tandem in the autumn of 1899, the very year that I too had steered a double machine over several of the passes I have herein described. They had acquired their mount from one of the oldest of cycle-making firms, and had not feared to descend long gradients with feet upon the rests. So far so good, but when they had survived the risks of alpine work, and had returned to smoother roads and humbler altitudes at home, their tandem broke in two as they were riding quietly along a Surrey lane. The man in front was hurled violently to the ground, and his nose was smashed to the level of his face. The wife behind fell onto his prostrate body, but luckily escaped material injury. And when the machine itself came to be examined, the lower tube of the forecarriage was found to be of light gauge, and absolutely without a liner. Of the wicked carelessness which allowed such a machine to leave the factory, one hardly dare trust oneself to speak. But if the reader's thoughts are suffered to dwell even for a moment on the possibility of the fracture having taken place when the riders were coasting down a tortuous mountain road, there will be no further need to emphasize the importance of great care in the selection of a machine. It is not to be assumed that everyone who proposes to undertake a tour among the passes must of necessity provide himself with a new machine. His mount may already embody, or be capable of ready transformation to, the main requirements of the case, and these I propose to detail in the light of my own experience of mountains and cycles alike. The machine should answer in every sense to the description of first class, and have cost a good price as prices go. There may be many cheap machines that are sound, but there have none the less been several legal actions which have clearly enough revealed the fact that the cutting of prices is liable to result in the non-provision of liners, and a lack of care at the very portions of the frame where care is most required. In other words, a cheap machine is not only likely to be less efficient than one on which more labour has been bestowed, but it is even more likely to be unsafe. Now that people venture much farther afield than formerly a wheel, and also ride more daringly because of the power of the modern brake, the stability of the cycle assumes a new phase of importance, for hitherto the rider has been ready enough to take for granted the item of strength, roundly speaking, and devote his attention chiefly to the question of gear and crank length, and the type of saddle or tyre. Henceforth it will be desirable, particularly if on alpine touring bent, that he should inquire more closely into the number of liners in his mount, and the resisting qualities of the rims and frame where brake power is concerned. Given a machine of all-round excellence, the most vital factor for consideration is the brake equipment. I have no hesitation in saying that 2 brakes are desirable, and each of thorough reliability and power. In actual practice it may never be needful to apply them both at once. In fact, as 2 will hold a tandem on the steepest pass, 1 may suffice for a single machine, if acting on the rim and capably fitted, but 2 are better than 1 for reasons of convenience as well as safety. It must be remembered that the descents are frequently of abnormal length, and may require the brake to be held on as a drag the whole way. Otherwise one is either unable to coast at all, or else one coasts at too high a rate of speed. This holding of the brake becomes tiring to a degree that is unlikely to be understood until actually experienced, and for this reason alone, if for no other, it is expedient to have a second brake at command, and use each in turn, thus avoiding a constant strain upon one hand. With a tandem I have had my arms numbed almost up to the elbow after many continuous miles of brake-retarded descent. But whereas two brakes on the double machine often require to be simultaneously in use, this is seldom necessary with a single machine. Consequently, the hands are never likely to be numbed, as the changes can be rung on the brakes as often as desired. From the point of view of safety, it is undoubtedly advisable to employ two brakes. Nothing is perfect in this world, and a brake is liable to fail just when it is most wanted, especially in view of the amount of work it has to do in alpine country. The man with two brakes may always enjoy, therefore, the comforting assurance that he is doubly protected against mishap, even if he never uses both the brakes at once, but at times he may be glad enough to do even this. There is another factor too, which a rider unaccustomed to Swiss touring would be unlikely to foresee, and that is the rapid wearing of the brake shoes, even of a rim brake. The life of any but a rubber-shod brake is considerable at home, but in the Alps one may wear it more on a single pass than in 6 months of ordinary touring. With two brakes, therefore, the wear on each is reduced by 1/2 if both are used at once, or with regular alternations, while if either is used continuously and is quickly wore down, it is exceedingly consoling to have the other in reserve when one has realized, as is certain to be the case ere long, that the grip of the brake is not equal to the occasion, and the machine begins to run away. With many forms of rim brake, moreover, the blocks of vulcanite or leather are liable to drop out. I lost one, for example, on the Julier Pass, but fortunately had provided myself with duplicates, and that these should be carried is essential for this reason as well as that of rapid wear. In a single week, I may add, I have worn out the shoes of the back and front brake alike on a tandem, and the same period may represent the life of a single brake if used continuously on a safety in the districts adjoining the Engadine. As regards the type of brake, I think that each should act upon the rim, as tyres may soon be torn into tatters if an ordinary spoon be utilised on long descents. The front brake should be actuated by a secondary or pull-up lever, and special care should be taken to avoid that type of shoe that is set parallel to the rim at every period of the pressure. The blocks should be parallel when at rest, but when the brake is applied they should meet the rim tangentially and be drawn on by the revolving wheel. Not only is their application much more gradual, but it is 50% more powerful than the other type, which has also the grievous disadvantage of being incapable of delicate application. At one moment it appears to be wholly ineffectual, though actually in contact with the rim, and then, with the least degree of additional pressure which the hand can apply, the brake locks the wheel. I have met with several brakes of this annoying species, and the only type that can be accounted satisfactory is that which approximates to the excellent Linley brake which is fitted to the front wheel of the Whippet machines. If the Linley brake was sold as a separate article, it would be a fortunate thing, for those who use other machines than the Whippet on alpine journeys at all events. And in my own case, I had often cause during my last tour among the passes to congratulate myself on having persuaded Mr. Linley to fit his brake to the front wheel of my rally tandem. With a Bowden brake on the rear wheel in addition, I was never short of retarding power, and the only way in which I should vary the arrangement on a future occasion, if using a tandem, would be to substitute a rotating handle for the lever in the case of the rear brake. It is one thing to have plenty of brake power at command, it is quite another to maintain the application of that power through the medium of the hands for a protracted period, almost beyond the possibilities of calculation of the stay-at-home wheelman. For this reason, the twisting handle pattern of the Bowden brake is more convenient, as if it is turned hard on, it will remain in that position, and thus relieve the hand of any pressure. For singles also, the Bowden brake is the most suitable for the rear wheel. Band brakes are powerful, but are no use on prolonged descents, as they soon get overheated. There is no reason why the rotating handle should not be used with the Bowden on a single as well as a tandem, but this should only be when two brakes are fitted. So far I have not seen a Bowden with a revolving handle that was quite as powerful as the lever patterns, and though it may be possible to make it so, I should be somewhat chary of recommending it for exclusive use. In conjunction with a front wheel brake it is admirable. If the rider prefers to depend upon one brake alone, it should undoubtedly be fitted to the back wheel and act upon the rim, which is the best place for withstanding a continuous application of retarding power, instead of the comparatively intermittent braking to which one is accustomed at home. There is no question, moreover, as to the back wheel being an infinitely better place than the front for the fitting of a brake. The rear framework is stronger than the forecarriage, for one thing, and there is also the important factor that a greater degree of power can be applied to the back wheel than the front without affecting the steering. Where sudden application is concerned, moreover, when the machine is travelling at high speed, a powerful front brake will have a tendency to slew the rear frame round, and on a grassy surface it will skid accordingly. A back wheel brake has a much greater margin of safety in this respect. The rims themselves are a matter for consideration. It is not to be inferred that a rider must of necessity convert his existing machine into a stronger article before setting out to Switzerland, but it is most certainly worth the while of every tourist who is about to order a new mount to specify a tandem rim to the back wheel, if not the front as well. Even if he confines his wanderings a wheel to the United Kingdom alone, he will in no way penalise himself, as the difference in weight between a tandem and ordinary rim respectively is about 2 ounces only. For alpine descents, moreover, the application of the brake may be so prolonged that the tandem rim is undoubtedly desirable, as there is less likelihood of it being pulled out of truth by the strain. With regard to the section of rim to be employed, my own experience leads me to believe that there is nothing to choose between one or another of the leading types as regards the tendency to go out of truth. It is especially advisable, however, that the brake blocks, as first fitted, should conform as far as possible to the shape of the rim, and if they have broad flat faces and are applied to the channel of the westward rim or the new brazeless pattern of the jointless, they should be trimmed until they touch the whole surface of the groove instead of the edges only. Care should be taken also to ensure that the brake shoes impinge upon the rims at the correct angle, as there is a wide difference in this respect between the various types. Tyre troubles are never welcome. In alpine regions they are simply hateful. As regards mere punctures, they are not more likely to occur upon the passes than elsewhere, and are even less probable, as one has neither thorns nor broken glass to fear. But gashes from sharp stones or nails must needs be guarded against. There is no necessity whatever to fit tandem tyres to a single, but the covers should be full roadsters, not road racers, and, if either be badly cut or worn, it would not be amiss to add a smith's band. In any case, both covers should be removed before the start, and every cut should be well lined with canvas. An hour or so devoted to this object will be well repaid in immunity from bursts through the giving way of the fabric wherever it has been weakened by a gash, and succumbs in time to the pressure of the inner tube. A good deal else may be done to the machine before the start to obviate trouble at a more inconvenient time. Particularly would I direct attention to the footrests. Those commonly available in England are of 2 kinds. One is fitted by being opened at the outer end, passed round the fork blade, and then tightened by a screw outside the latter. In the other type, the footrest is clamped to the fork blade and secured by a screw on the inside. Now the radical difference between these two is that the consequences are so much more serious in the one case than the other if the footrest is insecurely fitted and a slippage occurs at an unexpected moment. In the first type there is no more projection inside the fork blade than the thickness of the sheet steel, but in the second type the bolt and nut stand out considerably, and if they were not firmly fixed and the footrest slipped downwards, the spokes of most machines would be ripped out at once and a serious accident ensue. Indeed, deaths have been reported from this very cause. In my own experience I have known a footrest slip down the fork blade of a tandem when the riders were travelling at the rate of 25 miles an hour, and only the fact that the former type of rest was employed prevented a probable fatality, as the machine had an exceptionally narrow clearance. The moral, of course, is to take care, in any case, that the footrests are well screwed up, but vibration may loosen even a tight bolt, and personally I only use the second type of fixture on machines of which the forks are wide enough to make the tearing of the spokes impossible. The footrests play so important a part in alpine touring that I feel it necessary to devote a paragraph to this item, especially as at home one is apt to regard these accessories as once fitted, always fitted, and never accord them even a passing thought. Nothing further is required in the way of special provision for an alpine journey, so far as concerns the equipment of the machine. One has merely to take the ordinary precautions in the way of general overhauling. Of course, the chain should be put in thoroughly good condition. If it runs habitually in an oil bath, however, nothing more is needed than a cleansing of the gear case with paraffin and the recharging with a fresh supply of oil, which should be of the heavy syrupy type, such as Viscoleum. The chain bolt should be examined and tightened up anew if it has become at all loose, and the process of flushing and relubricating of every bearing throughout the machine should be gone through without fail. If the machine has been in use for some time, the pedal attachments, crank cotters, head bolts and seat pillar bolt should all be scrutinized for any signs of wear, and the valves, if of the Woods type, should be fitted with new rubber sleeves. All these are merely the usual precautions which the experienced tourist has learned to take wherever his holiday may be planned for, but they are doubly necessary in respect of the Alps. At home there is a plenitude of cycle shops at which repairs may be executed and supplies obtained, and there is always the railway to fall back upon. In the Pass country there is neither the one nor the other alternative, and any irreparable accident or the loss of a fitting or tool that cannot be replaced is a much more inconvenient and even more serious a matter. Assuming that the tourist has made his selection of a cycle, or attended to the equipment and overhauling of an existing machine on the lines I have laid down, there yet remain two directions in which some measure of additional precaution is required. The first concerns the provision of tools and spare fittings. The second relates to the care of the cycle while the tour is actually in progress. There are good and sufficient reasons why one should be more provident in the matter of spanners, repair outfits and the like. In the first place, such a thing as theft on the railway journey is not unknown. The last time, for example, that I journeyed by train to Davosplatz, I discovered on arrival that my tool bag had been rifled and that I was bereft of a spanner, oil can and repair outfit, an experience which suggested the advisability of using a padlock for the future. Secondly, it is very easy to lose a wrench when attending to some little roadside adjustment or repair in a country that abounds in precipices and wooded ravines. The implement may only drop onto the road, or it may slip away down a slope to a point where it is beyond recovery. If the rider be touring alone, he should assuredly not reduce the contents of his tool bag to the most limited dimensions, and if with a party, it will not pay for the members thereof to cooperate by agreeing to divide their pumps, repair outfits and the like in the proportion of one, say, to every pair of riders. Each unit of the party should be fully equipped, for he never knows but what he may get separated from the others just at the time when he may most need their assistance. For example, a party may be coasting down a long descent and soon fall into extended single file. The rear rider may be less daring than his fellows, and just when he has dropped a little way behind, he may sustain a puncture. The last rider but one may have just rounded a corner and be out of earshot, and the unlucky individual who has to dismount is in a peculiarly unpleasant predicament if he has no repair outfit, having agreed to go shares with one of the men in front. What may then happen is this, that the others go flying down, perhaps for several miles, revelling in the intoxicating delights of an alpine coast, ere the absence of the rear man is discovered. Naturally, they do not care to face the toilsome ascent, and have to wait while the luckless one makes up his lost ground at a walking pace, and nobody concerned will be in the best of tempers when the reunion is complete. Each rider should be amply provided against contingencies of this sort, and so far from disdaining to carry a repair outfit, he should even go to the length of avoiding the trumpery tackle usually sold under that name, and take instead a good fat tube of solution, and enough patching rubber to enable him to cope with the possible contingency of a burst or slit tyre. The places where solution may be obtained are few and far between, and cycle tools are nearly as scarce. There is a cycle shop at St. Moritz, and one at Coire. At the latter place, by the way, I introduced the proprietor to a free wheel, rim brakes, and even a gear case for the first time. At Davosplatz I got an oil can and an apology for a spanner at an ironmonger's, but there was no cycle shop there up to 1899. I know of no other place in the whole of the district I have described where anything in the cycling line is procurable. It is of course impossible to go to the length of carrying actual spare parts in case of a broken crank or pedal or the like, but at least the rider should carry a spare link or two of his chain, a chain bolt, a valve, spare blocks for his rim brakes, and even a few balls. Except the brake blocks, probably none of these will be required, but if they are wanted, they will be wanted badly, for it must be remembered that a walk down a pass in case of breakdown is almost as fatiguing as a climb. A very handy thing to carry, moreover, is a length of copper wire, the use of which has almost died out since the solid tyre was displaced, but which I have often found of great service in more ways than one. A pair of pliers should not be forgotten, nor a small but effective screwdriver. Then, too, there is wisdom in being a little faddy as regards the provision of spare straps, elastic bands, a ball of string, and luggage labels. They may all come in usefully at times. The care of the cycle from day to day involves only the ordinary attentions, save in two respects. So much coasting will be indulged in, that the machine will inevitably be exposed to greater degrees of vibration and strain, and it is desirable in consequence to apply the test of the spanner to the nuts a little oftener than usual, and in particular to watch the chain bolt. The wear of the brake blocks too, unless kept in view, may result in the discovery that command is lacking on a steep descent when urgently required, and the experience is far from welcome. The blocks may not require renewal even at the end of a fortnight, but they are almost certain to require adjustment, and cannot be watched too carefully. It is so easy to forget these details in the desire to be up and doing as each morning comes round, that I set forth these desiderata even at the risk of appearing unduly cautious. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Cycling in the Alps by C.L. FREESTON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion. Were I writing about any other region but the Alps, I should not hesitate to put forward a suggested itinerary or two, but Switzerland is so full of resources that such a course would be more arbitrary than helpful. Tourists differ materially too, as to the amount of time at their disposal, of money they can afford to spend, and of hard work they are willing to do. Then again, the subject of a Swiss holiday will present itself so differently to the man who has never visited the country at all, to one who has already seen some of its leading lions as an ordinary tourist. In the former event, I should certainly advise that some of these show places should be included in the programme, and attempts at higher ground not pitched upon too comprehensive a scale, unless time be no consideration. Such well-known places as Bâle, Zurich, Lucerne, Constance, and Thun are well worth seeing on their own account, and it is particularly desirable that they should be visited at the earliest opportunity, for the very important reason that once higher ground has been reached, the tourist's interest in the towns simply melts into thin air. No one who has cycled over any of the passes would think of mooning around Lucerne or sulking in rain-sodden Interlaken. The difference between the atmosphere of the big towns or lowland valleys and that of the passes is too vital to make the former more than barely endurable after tasting the superior delights of loftier ground. The pastoral beauty of some portions of the Swiss lowlands I have no desire whatever to depreciate, and if only leisure were at everyone's command, a long course of cycling on the level, relatively speaking, would not go unrequited. But if a man has only a month to spare, and many have still less, he cannot conveniently attend to high and low ground alike, not because of distance, but of temperature. By the time the snows have melted from the passes, and the sleigh has ceded place to the heavier diligence, the more level portions of the country will have become oppressively hot, and if he visits them when they are less sultry, his month will have expired ere he dare venture upon really high ground. Nevertheless, if prepared to stand 3 or 4 days of heat, the effects of which can be largely obviated by early rising and resting between 11 o'clock and 3, it will be worth his while to cycle from Bâle to Schaffhausen, thence to Constance, and along the lakeside to its south-eastern extremity, from which point he may proceed to Landquart and take the train to Davosplatz. This journey would suffice to get him into form before tackling the passes round the Engadine, and of itself would prove thoroughly enjoyable. The beautiful lake of Lucerne, or that of Thun, could be viewed on the homeward journey, if he returned by way of the Oberalp, the Furka, and the Grimsel, for at Meiringen he could make his choice between the two divergences. It should be unnecessary to state the necessity of a thorough study of Baedeker or Murray, and of a reliable map before arranging the details of one's tour, but many people are sadly improvident in this respect. It should be equally unnecessary to enjoin the desirability of becoming a member of the Cyclist Touring Club. Of the different state of things that now prevails with regard to customs arrangements, as compared with the days when the club had wrung no concessions from foreign governments, the tourist who begins his continental travels now has no conception. I could speak feelingly, however, if I were to draw upon the painful experiences of the past. It is not only in the matter of customs dues that the club will benefit him much. He can draw upon its excellent touring bureau for advice on any point of difficulty, and also obtain without trouble the most suitable of maps. I would particularly recommend as regards Switzerland the Carte routière de la Suisse pour vélocipédistes and the Carte routière du Touring Club Suisse, both of which are kept in stock at the CTC headquarters. The first named is an excellent map of the country generally, and most useful for tour planning purposes, while the second is invaluable to the pass climber. The roads are marked on a tricoloured system according to the gradients, those having a rise or fall of 4% being coloured yellow, those between 4 and 7% being green, and those still steeper being black. From actual experience I can testify to the accuracy of these markings, which are of inestimable utility in appraising the probable amount of ground that may conveniently be covered from day to day. The yellow-coloured sections may be regarded as rideable throughout. Some of the green portions may be ridden by the very strong, but it is safer to regard them as easy walks, while the black lines inevitably mean slow progress. By this map it may be seen at a glance what is the nature of the work before the rider on any given journey, and what the length of time he should allow for each individual stage. The map will also guide him as to which side of a pass it is better to ascend, and which to descend, according to the amount of unrideable gradient on each. There is another set of maps, the Deutsche Straßenprofilkarte für Radfahrer, which professes to give profile plans for all the higher passes, but my own experience leads me to regard it as all but useless. As to general information concerning continental touring, such as railway and steamboat charges, hotels, repairers, customs and the like, The foreign handbook of the Cyclist Touring Club is indispensable as a vade mecum, and particularly valuable is the vocabulary it contains in 4 languages of technical terms peculiar to cycling and the cycle. The member who tours abroad has certainly no reason to complain of what the big club has done for him in every possible direction. For the rest, it only remains for me to wish for all those who may be induced, by the perusal of the descriptions I have given, to follow the same wheel marks, that they may derive an equal measure of enjoyment to that which I have received from all my Alpine journeys. In the desire to be, above all things, practical, I have essayed throughout this book to stifle an amount of enthusiasm upon the subject which is very potent and very real. But I am bound to say here that among all my touring experiences, the recollections of the passes are ineffaceable and supreme, and that nothing, the hard work notwithstanding, has afforded so great a degree of genuine and satisfying pleasure. End of Cycling in the Alps by C. L. FREESTON. Read by Phil Benson.